to attend other urgent meetings. I would also like to remind you that simultaneous English-Arabic interpretation is available for you today, should you wish to use it. Now, I have the honour to invite His Excellency, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, to deliver his opening remarks.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the government of Sweden and Switzerland for co-hosting this conference and the representatives of governments and organizations taking part for your solidarity with the people of Yemen. Today, famine is bearing down on Yemen. The race is on if we want to prevent hunger and starvation from taking millions of lives. It is impossible to overstate the severity of the suffering in Yemen. More than 20 million Yemenis need humanitarian assistance and protection, with women and children among the hardest hit. That means 2 out of every 3 people in Yemen need food aid, health care, or other life-saving support from humanitarian organizations. More than 60 million people are expected to go hungry this year. And nearly 50,000 Yemenis are already starving to death in famine-like conditions. The worst hunger is in areas affected by the conflict. 4 million people across Yemen have been forced from their homes. The recent Houthi offensive in Marib threatens to displace hundreds of thousands more. Last year, the conflict in Yemen killed or injured more than 2,000 civilians. It has devastated the economy and crushed public services. Barely half of Yemen's health facilities are fully functional. The COVID-19 pandemic is one more deadly threat in a country facing such severe health challenges. For most people, life in Yemen is now unbearable. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, childhood in Yemen is a special kind of hell. Yemeni children are starving. This year, nearly half of all children under 5 in Yemen are said to suffer from acute malnutrition. The symptoms include wasting, depression, and tiredness. 400,000 of those children face severe acute malnutrition and could die without urgent treatment. Starving children are even more vulnerable to preventable diseases like cholera, diphtheria, and measles. Every 10 minutes, a child dies a needless death from diseases like those ones in Yemen. And every day, Yemeni children are killed or maimed in the conflict. Sick and injured children are turned away by overwhelmed health facilities that don't have drugs or equipment to treat them. This war is swallowing a whole generation of Yemenis. It has to stop. It's been clear for years that there is no military solution in Yemen. The only path to peace is through an immediate nationwide ceasefire and a set of confidence-building measures, followed by an inclusive Yemeni-led political process under United Nations auspices and supported by the international community. The people of Yemen have articulated what they want: life-saving support from the world, peaceful political participation, accountable governance, equal citizenship, and economic justice. I urge all parties to work with my special envoy, Martin Griffiths, to reach a peaceful resolution to the conflict. All our actions must be driven by these. This is the 5th time we have convened the high-level pledging event to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The bitter truth is that we will convene a 6th event next year unless the war ends. We must create and seize every opportunity to save lives, stave off a mass famine, and forge a path to peace. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the humanitarian situation in Yemen has never been worse. Yet, last year, humanitarian funding fell. We received $1.9 billion, just half of what we needed, and half of what we received the year before. At the same time, the Yemeni currency collapsed, and remittances from Yemenis overseas dried up as the pandemic hit economies everywhere. The impact has been brutal. Humanitarian organizations providing food, water, and healthcare have reduced or even closed their programs. Families have nothing to fall back on. 2 years ago, in 2018, thanks to the generosity of donors, including Yemen's neighbors, humanitarian agencies helped to prevent the famine that then threatened Yemen. Today, reducing aid is a death sentence for entire families. With the war raging, Yemen's children are paying the price. And we know from studying the impact of conflict that those children will continue to pay a high price long after the guns fall silent. Children who suffer from stunting in their childhood may never fulfill their physical and mental potential. Economic damage, divisions, and grievances can last decades, blighting entire regions. Communities ravaged by conflict bear emotional scars for generations. We must end this senseless conflict now and start dealing with enormous consequences immediately. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the moment to step back from Yemen. We must equal and surpass the levels of funding we had in 2018. This year, we need $3.85 billion to support 16 million Yemenis on the brink of catastrophe. I implore all donors to fund our appeal generously to stop famine engulfing the country. Every dollar counts. The funding you provide through the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan, the Central Emergency Response Fund, or the country-based pooled fund will make an enormous and concrete difference. In many cases, the difference between life and death. The United Nations family and our partners across Yemen are ready to scale up aid operations. Delivering aid in Yemen is challenging, but humanitarian workers are up to the challenge. Throughout last year, United Nations agencies and our partners helped more than 10 million people each month working in every one of Yemen's 333 districts. I urge all parties once again to heed the requirements of international humanitarian law to facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access. The assistance you pledge today will not only prevent the spread of famine and save lives, it will help create the conditions for lasting peace. Thank you. Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your remarks. I now have the pleasure to invite His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis, the Vice President of the Federal Council of Switzerland, to deliver remarks on behalf of the Government of Switzerland as a co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lowcock. Mr. Secretary General, Madam Minister for Foreign Affairs, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Swiss federal government, I would like to welcome you to the high-level pledging event for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I extend a special welcome to my co-hosts today, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Sweden's Foreign Minister Ann Linde, and Per Olsen. In ordinary times, we would gather in Geneva, where we promote peace and human dignity in armed conflict. However, these are certainly no ordinary times. COVID-19 has turned our lives upside down. What has not changed, however, is our humanitarian commitment. Even though the global pandemic prevents us from meeting in person, I call on you to bring the same commitment to this virtual conference. Let us embrace the spirit of humanitarian Geneva in digital format. This global pandemic affects us all. However, it is people that are already suffering the most that are hit particularly hard. Like the people of Yemen, it is for them that we are gathered here today. COVID-19 is not only a global health crisis, it also acts as a magnifying glass. The people of Yemen have suffered for years from armed conflict, food insecurity, infectious diseases, the effects of climate change, and high inflation. COVID-19 has made the terrible living conditions of these people even worse. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid every single day. 16 million people, almost twice the population of Switzerland, are affected by food insecurity. As shocking as these figures are, they are not just bare numbers. Behind those numbers are mothers and fathers who wake up every morning not knowing how they are going to feed their children. The brutality of the crisis and the pressing nature of the needs mean that we have to act now. So far, only a fraction of the humanitarian response plan for 2021 has been funded. It is our responsibility to fund this plan now and effectively. This year, Switzerland will provide 14 million Swiss francs for humanitarian aid in Yemen. This is part of a long-term commitment, a commitment that totals 71 million Swiss francs over the past 5 years. However, humanitarian aid can only be effective if it reaches the people in need. Humanitarian aid have access to those who suffer most. Switzerland therefore calls on all parties to ensure rapid, unimpeded and sustainable humanitarian access throughout the country. In addition, we must respect international humanitarian law. Civilians, as well as civilian and medical infrastructure, must be protected at all costs. Dear colleagues, we are here today because we want to relieve the humanitarian suffering in Yemen. Nevertheless, we must also address the root causes of this crisis. If we want to provide long-term stability, we need a comprehensive political solution. I therefore call on all parties to immediately cease hostilities and resume peace talks. At the same time, Switzerland fully supports the peace process led by the UN. As one of the host states for UN peace talks on Yemen, we are ready to continue offering our good offices in the future. The responsibility to put an end to this humanitarian crisis lies first and foremost with the involved. However, after more than 6 years of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, the international community must reflect on its own approach. We need to develop strategies to provide long-term prospects for the Yemeni people, and this requires a strong link between humanitarian development, human rights, and peace approaches. Most of all, we need people who provide help on the ground, people like the humanitarian workers in Yemen, people who help to alleviate suffering under the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. I would therefore like to thank them, national and international NGOs, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and last but not least, the UN. I greatly appreciate your dedication, and I am deeply impressed by your work. In closing, I appeal to all of us to support this commitment by taking the opportunity of today's conference to mobilize the necessary financial resources and ensure their swift distribution. Let us give hope and, above all, bring future prospects to the millions of women, men, and children in Yemen. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Cassis, for your remarks. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Anne Linder, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sweden, to deliver her remarks on behalf of the Government of Sweden as a co-host.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking all of you for attending this donor conference virtually this year. I would also like to thank Saudi Arabia for co-hosting last year's conference. This is the fourth time that Sweden, Switzerland, and the UN have co-hosted a high-level pledging event for Yemen. The urgency of the crisis has been reiterated at every pledging event to date. But never has the urgency been greater than it is today. The success of this year's conference is therefore crucial. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is the worst in the world. For years, need have been huge and suffering immense. But in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's economic collapse and the brutal conflicts have combined to push Yemen to the cliff's edge. At the same time, previously consistent and generous donor support to the humanitarian response has dwindled. As a result, life-saving humanitarian programs has been scaled down. And now, Yemen is being pushed even closer to the worst famine the world has seen in decades. 5 million Yemenis are just one step away from full-scale catastrophe. Hunger crisis, like humanitarian crisis in general, impact women in proportionality. Women eat least and last. When there is not enough food to go around, when food rations have been reduced, women are the first to go hungry. As highlighted just a few moments ago, at a side event hosted by Sweden and Switzerland, a silent emergency is unfolding before our eyes. 2 in 5 Yemeni children under the age of 5 will be acutely malnourished this year. Not all of them will survive. Those who do risk being scared by irreversible damage to their development. Yemen is now the world's most dangerous place for children. Ladies and gentlemen, today, I hope we will once again demonstrate our commitment to the Yemeni people and to our shared humanity. The 2021 UN Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen requires close to $4 billion to avert famine and address acute humanitarian needs. Channeling support through the UN is the most effective way to ensure a coordinated and principled humanitarian response. I am pleased to announce that Sweden's initial allocation to HRP in 2021 will amount of $31 million. The full amount will be distributed before the end of this month. This is only an initial allocation and more money follow later in the year. In addition, Sweden also remains one of the world's largest donors of core funding, which support the humanitarian operations of the World Food Programme, UNICEF, and other humanitarian agencies operating in Yemen. Ladies and gentlemen, a lack of funds is not the only obstacle in impeding the humanitarian response in Yemen. As co-chair of the Humanitarian Senior Officials meeting on Yemen, Sweden continues to call on all parties to remove all restrictions and to ensure full, safe and unhindered access for their timely delivery of humanitarian aid to people in need. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN-led humanitarian relief efforts are indispensable and need our urgent support. At the same time, the only sustainable solution to the humanitarian crisis is an end to the fighting and a political solution to the conflict. We have recently seen increased attention to the UN-led peace efforts. But on the ground, renewed escalation has led to immense loss of life and further displacement and suffering. The ongoing offensive in Marib, threatening millions of internally displaced Yemenis, and the hostility in Taiz and Hodeidah must cease. The parties must commit to a ceasefire and resume talks leading to inclusive, Yemeni-owned political process with the full and meaningful participation of women. Here too, strong international support will be crucial, and Sweden remains ready to help in any way we can. 2020 was a challenging year. Now, in 2021, many of us are hopeful that things will slowly get better. But for the 21 million Yemenis in need of humanitarian assistance to survive, there are no signs of a brighter year ahead. As Yemen is being pushed closer to the brink of starvation, aid levels are dropping and food rations are shrinking. We now have the opportunity to change course. I hope that in 2022, we will be able to look back and say that we managed once again to come together to avert famine in Yemen. I also hope that we will be able to say that we managed to restore the dignity of the people of Yemen. And I hope that we will be able to say that we began paving the way to end this devastating conflict. The people of Yemen have suffered enough. Thank you. Shukran.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Linda for her remarks, and I'm pleased now to give the floor to Mr. David Gressley, who's the United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Yemen, who is speaking to us now from Sana'a. David, please go ahead.
Very much. Secretary General, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to the Prime Minister and the government of Yemen for your participation and for the constructive role you've been playing in addressing the humanitarian situation. I arrived in Yemen 1 week ago today and have already had the opportunity and privilege to speak to the government and to families who have been displaced by the conflict. I'm now speaking to you from Sana'a, where I will be working to address the immense humanitarian challenges facing this country. It's clear the needs are enormous. Yemen has been caught in a tightening loop of misery since the war began in 2015. Nearly 50,000 Yemenis are already experiencing famine. 5 million more are only a step away. Almost 500,000 young children could die from hunger in the coming weeks if they aren't treated. Women and children are particularly vulnerable. Yemen is approaching a point of no return. We make the wrong choice now, what comes after is the biggest famine in a generation. The prospects for the country shifted when on 4th of February, President Biden laid out the new U.S. posture on Yemen, reaffirming a U.S. focus on a diplomatic solution to the conflict and easing the humanitarian suffering of the Yemeni people. There's no doubt that new position on Yemen and how it's been welcomed by others creates an opportunity. The only question is whether all those with a stake choose to take that opportunity and run with it. So what does it look like in practice? The parties to the conflict need to get round the table and talk. The Ansar Allah offensive on Mideast, which has escalated over the last few weeks, is a step in the wrong direction. To avoid another humanitarian catastrophe, that offensive must stop. Fuel ships need to be released. The blockade preventing importation of goods and commodities must also be lifted. We call upon all friends of Yemen, regional countries, and generous donors to help, not only to bring people together to talk peace, but to work together to alleviate suffering and bring real, tangible, sustainable development opportunities to the table. This political process needs to be underpinned by a sustainable humanitarian situation to enable Yemen to build a sustainable and prosperous future. And that is where everyone in this conference has an important choice to make. As we work together to build the path to peace, we need to rebuild the country, rebuild public systems, rebuild the economy, and most urgently, feed the children who are, at this very moment, wasting away because they don't have food and medical care. Famine is creeping its way back into Yemen, and if we don't ramp up the aid operation quickly, it will swallow a whole generation. And peace is of little use if you're dead. So now please allow me to be specific about what we need you to do. Nearly $4 billion is what we need today to hold back a massive famine tomorrow. In 2019, we received $3.6 billion, nearly 90% of what was required that year. In 2020, we received just under $2 billion, around half of what we got the year before and half of what was needed. Aid had to be cut as a result. UN aid agencies went from helping 13 million people per month to only 9 million. Many people who needed help did not get it. We need you all to return to the funding levels of 2019 at a minimum. So please, pledge generously. With nearly $4 billion, we can help more than 16 million people. The UN is in Yemen and has the capacity to scale up to this challenge. We ask you to please pay pledges promptly. We want to turn promises into food, water, medicines, and other life-saving aid as quickly as possible. Time is not on our side. The difference between pledges paid promptly or not is the difference between life and death. We also implore you to provide flexible funding. This allows for quick, agile decision-making. My thanks to all of you who will be pledging today. My thanks also to those who regularly fund our Central Emergency Response Fund and the in-country Yemen Humanitarian Pool Fund. If the world chooses not to help today or not to help enough, we will have squandered this opportunity to stave off famine and take a meaningful step towards peace. It would make mass famine a certainty and actively undermine the prospects for peace. The people of Yemen are a dignified people. What they need is peace and opportunity, and for us to restore their faith that the world is not just watching, but acting. While aid money can't buy peace or solve the problems which create humanitarian need, it does save lives, and it does make the chances of solving those root causes much more likely. So if you're not feeding the people, you're feeding the war. Thank you, Shukran.
Thank you, David, for your remarks. So that concludes the opening segment of today's event. Let me now announce the start of segment 2, which is statements and announcements. And I'd like to invite His Excellency the United Nations Secretary General to open the floor.
Thank you, Mark. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to open the floor for statements and pledges. And I am pleased to welcome His Excellency Dr. Ma'in Saeed Abdul Malek, Prime Minister of Yemen, and I thank him for his presence with us today. Your Excellency, Mr. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
رئيس ووزير خارجية سويسرا السيدة آن لين وزيرة خارجية مملكة السويد، السادة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، بداية أشكر لكم مشاركتكم في هذا المؤتمر الهام لتمويل خطة الاستجابة الإنسانية لليمن للعام الحالي 2021. وأود أن أشكر السيد الأمين العام وكل من سويسرا والسويد استضافتهم للمؤتمر وجهودهم إلى جانب وكيل الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة السيد مارك لوكوك في تنظيم المؤتمر وحشد الدعم الدولي لتمويل جهود الإغاثة في اليمن. وكذلك أود أن أشكر الدول الشقيقة والصديقة التي دعمت اليمن خلال السنوات الماضية، وفي مقدمتها المملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة ودولة الكويت والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والمملكة المتحدة وألمانيا والاتحاد الأوروبي واليابان وكندا وغيرها من الدول التي كان لها دورا كبيرا في تخفيف معاناة الشعب اليمني. سيد الأمين، السادة الحضور، لقد وضع تفشي جائحة كورونا البشرية جمعاء أمام أخطار داهمة وتحديات صعبة واستثنائية حملت الموت للأفراد والركود إلى الاقتصاد والعزلة إلى المجتمعات والدول. ليكون العام 2020 الأشد وطأة وقسوة على اليمنيين، فبالإضافة إلى الآثار الكارثية لجائحة كورونا على حياة الأفراد وعلى النظام الصحي والمنشآت المتهالكة وتراجع النشاط الاقتصادي وارتفاع التضخم وتردي الخدمات واتساع رقعة الفقر والبطالة والأوضاع المأساوية للنازحين، تراجعت تعهدات المانحين للأعمال الإغاثية في اليمن بشكل حاد العام الماضي، مما دفع بالأزمة الإنسانية في اليمن إلى مستويات قياسية. سيد الأمين العام، السادة الحضور، تعاني اليمن أوضاعا قاسية وصعبة وتحتاج إلى وقوف دول العالم معها بالدعم الإغاثي والاقتصادي لتفادي تردي الأوضاع وتضاعف الأزمة الإنسانية. على مدار السنوات الماضية ساهمت الحكومة بقدر المستطاع في جهود حشد التمويلات اللازمة لخطة الاستجابة الإنسانية، وقدمت كل الدعم والتسهيلات المطلوبة لنشاط المنظمات الإغاثية. كان وما زال تقييمنا إيجابي لجهود ونشاط هذه المنظمات، رغم أن هناك الكثير الذي ينبغي إصلاحه. نحن بحاجة إلى لاستثمار هذه المساعدات بصورة أكثر كفاءة، وأن لا يتم التسامح إطلاقا مع هدر هذه المساعدات أو نهبها أو حرفها عن مسارها ووصولها لمستحقيها، وأن نعطي اليمنيين أملا بتخصيص جزء من هذا الدعم لمسار التنمية وخلق فرص العمل وسبل تحسين العيش. ونؤكد هنا التزام الحكومة بتسهيل عمل المنظمات الإنسانية وتسهيل وصول المساعدات، ونحن حريصون على الشراكة مع المانحين والمنظمات العاملة في اليمن، ليس فقط كمستفيدين من المساعدات ولكن أيضا كشركاء في التخطيط والتنفيذ والتقييم والرقابة. إن الاقتصاد اليمني يمر حاليا بأزمة حادة، فقد تجاوز نسبة التضخم في أسعار السلع والخدمات 50%، وتراجعت قيمة العملة اليمنية بنسبة 40%، وهو ما ينعكس كل يوم بشكل واضح على الأزمة الإنسانية. ودون دعم الاقتصاد ودعم استقرار العملة لن تستطيع التدخلات الإنسانية معالجة أو إيقاف التدهور القائم. ففي العام 2018 كان التدخل الكريم من الأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية بدعم البنك المركزي بمبلغ 2 مليار دولار هو الأساس في تخفيف حدة الأزمة الإنسانية وتجاوز خطر المجاعة واستقرار العملة في حينها. والآن ينبغي أن يكون دعم الاقتصاد اليمني ودعم استقرار العملة أولوية قصوى وعاجلة، وندعو بشكل واضح إلى ضرورة وضع آلية لمصارفة الأموال المقدمة من المانحين للعمل الإغاثي في اليمن عبر البنك المركزي اليمني. إن خطورة التعامل خارج إطار مؤسسات الدولة يهدد بتقويضها وانهيارها، وهذا خطأ فادح يقود إلى الفوضى وإلى أضرار طويلة الأمد. أدعو الأشقاء والأصدقاء إلى دعم الحكومة والاقتصاد والشراكة معها لتعزيز عمل مؤسسات الدولة. سيادة الأمين العام، السادة الحضور الأكارم، إن الحكومة اليمنية الجديدة حكومة الكفاءة السياسية، والتي تم تشكيلها قبل قرابة الشهرين بموجب اتفاق الرياض وبعد جهود مضنية ومحمودة قامت بها المملكة العربية السعودية لجمع مختلف الأطراف وبرعاية ومتابعة من فخامة الرئيس عبد الرب منصور، هذه تعمل بجهد لمعالجة تحديات وتراكمات معقدة من العاصمة المؤقتة عدن. وقد اسمينا هذا العام بعام التعافي، ونأمل لإنجاز إصلاحات جوهرية وأساسية تسهم برفع إيرادات الدولة وترشيد النفقات وتحسين الخدمات ورفع أداء المؤسسات وتفعيل عمل الأجهزة الرقابية وتعزيز المبادئ الشفافية والنزاهة. وبالنسبة لمواجهة جائحة كورونا، قد قامت الحكومة بتشكيل لجنة عليا لمواجهة الطوارئ وفتحت 19 مركزا للعزل في مختلف المناطق التي تسيطر عليها الحكومة، ورصدت ميزانيات لدعم القطاع الصحي، واتخذت جملة من الإجراءات الوقائية، كما عملت مع الشركاء الدوليين لتوفير الاحتياجات الضرورية، وهو ما أسهم بتجاوز الموجة الأولى من الوباء، وما زال احتمال تفشي الموجة الثانية قائما. ولذا مهم التركيز على دعم القطاع الصحي كأولوية ودعم توفير اللقاحات لتغطية الاحتياج في اليمن. وهنا أود أن أشكر القائمين على مبادرة الكوفاكس والمانحين من الأشقاء والأصدقاء على الالتزام بتوفير 20% من اللقاحات لليمن، ونحضر حاليا مع شركائنا في الصحة العالمية وتحالف اللقاح العالمي واليونيسيف والبنك الدولي لاستلام الدفعة الأولى من اللقاح، ونأمل أن يتم تغطية النسبة المتبقية من اللقاح لحماية المواطنين من تداعيات هذه الجائحة. سيد الأمين العام، السادة الحضور، وأنا أتحدث إليكم الآن، تتعرض مدينة مأرب التي تحتضن أكثر من 2 مليون نازح هربوا إليها من الإرهاب والاضطهاد والقمع الوحشيين الذي تمارسه جماعة الحوثيين العنصرية على المواطنين في مناطق سيطرتها منذ انقلابهم على الدولة والمسار السياسي وشعلهم الحرب في سبتمبر 2014. تتعرض الأحياء السكنية لمدينة مأرب ومخيمات النازحين لقصف إجرامي بالصواريخ البالستية ومختلف أنواع المقذوفات. أرجو أن يكون بوسعكم تخيل ما يعاني 2 مليون يمثلوا 60% من إجمالي النازحين في اليمن من قبل ميليشيا تحترف القتل والتعذيب والإخفاء القسري وفقا لكل التقارير الإنسانية والدولية. والحقيقة أنه منذ اتفاقية ستوكهولم في العام 2018 التي أوقفت استعادة القوات الحكومية لميناء الحديدة الهام، هناك تصعيد للحرب من طرف واحد هو ميليشيا الحوثيين العنصرية، سواء على المواطنين في مناطق سيطرتها أو على مناطق تحت سيطرة الدولة. ورفضت الميليشيا الانقلابية كل مبادرات السلام والتهدئة، بما في ذلك نداء الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة لوقف إطلاق النار وحشد الجهود لمواجهة كورونا والأزمة الإنسانية. جميعكم تابع الهجوم الإرهابي الذي نفذته جماعة الحوثي الانقلابية على مطار عدن في 30 ديسمبر الماضي، حيث تم استقبال حكومة الكفاءة السياسية ب3 صواريخ موجهة بدقة بهدف الإجهاز على الحكومة وخلق حالة
I thank the Prime Minister of Yemen for his statement. If there is eventually anything that you would like to complete, we will revert back to him. And I shall now give the floor to His Excellency, the Secretary of State of the United States of America, Antony Blinken.
Thank you so much, Secretary General Guterres, Foreign Minister Cassis, Foreign Minister Linda, Undersecretary General Lowcock, everyone in the UN Office for the coordination of humanitarian affairs, for bringing us together today. The humanitarian crisis taking place in Yemen is the largest and most urgent in the world. 20 million people, including millions of children, desperately need help. The United States is committed to doing our part, both to provide aid and to help address the obstacles standing in the way of humanitarian access. Today, I'm pleased to announce nearly $191 million in additional humanitarian assistance from the United States, bringing our fiscal year 2021 funding up to more than $350 million. In total, the United States has provided more than $3.4 billion in aid to the Yemeni people since the crisis began 6 years ago. This funding supports our partners in delivering assistance that is needed immediately, including food, protection, education, shelter, health, water, sanitation, and the prevention and treatment of severe malnutrition. It also goes to longer-term humanitarian needs, like the rehabilitation of water systems, the repair of critical roads, and support to help families earn incomes. I commend the generous pledges made by other donors. Now, we need others, especially those in the region, to step up. The scale of this emergency can be addressed only through a sustained and coordinated effort by a broad range of donors, UN agencies, and NGOs. And we must act fast because the economic crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic are making the humanitarian crisis even worse. I want to recognize the courageous aid workers who are risking their lives to help bring assistance to those who need it. All parties across northern and southern Yemen must cease interference in aid operations and allow assistance to reach the innocent women, children, and men who have borne the brunt of this crisis. We also call on all parties to allow the unhindered import and distribution of fuel. Fuel shortages like the one happening now only worsen the humanitarian situation. Of course, while aid can help lessen suffering and mitigate the desperation that often fuels conflicts, aid alone will not end the conflict. We can only end the humanitarian crisis in Yemen by ending the war in Yemen. And so the United States is reinvigorating our diplomatic efforts to end the war. We've listened to the concerns from the United Nations, from humanitarian groups, and members of Congress, and we are committed to putting the well-being of the Yemeni people at the forefront of our policy, while continuing to put pressure on the leaders of Ansarallah, also known as the Houthis. We call on the Houthis to cease their cross-border attacks and military offensives that prolong this war. We support the UN-led process and UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths in their efforts to establish a ceasefire, increase humanitarian access, and resume peace talks. And we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and cease attacks on civilians. As you may know, I recently appointed a U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking. He reports that the Saudis and the Republic of Yemen government are committed and eager to find a solution to the conflict. We call on the Houthis to match this commitment. The necessary first step is to stop their offensive against Marib, a city where 1 million internally displaced people live, and to join the Saudis and the government in Yemen in making constructive moves toward peace. Let me conclude by reiterating that we support the UN-led process to establish a ceasefire. We're committed to increasing humanitarian access. We insist that violations against civilians cease, and we are hopeful for the speedy resumption of peace talks aimed at finally bringing an end to this conflict. The time is now to make this push and bring about a more stable, prosperous Yemen, whose citizens will be able to rebuild their lives and, at long last, have hope in a better future. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State of the United States of America for his statement, and I shall now give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabia, Supervisor General, King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. معالي الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يشرفني أن أعرب لكم عن شكر المملكة العربية السعودية وتقديرها العميق لجمهورية سويسرا ومملكة السويد والأمم المتحدة على حرصهم على تنظيم هذا المؤتمر الافتراضي في هذه الظروف الاستثنائية التي يمر بها العالم من جراء تداعيات فيروس كوفيد-19 وسللاته المتحورة، آملاً أن نتوصل إلى حلول أكثر استدامة وأعمق أثر لرفع المعاناة الإنسانية في اليمن والتعامل مع مسبباتها. السيدات والسادة، إن المملكة العربية السعودية ترتكز منذ تأسيسها على يد المؤسس الملك عبد العزيز آل سعود طيب الله ثراه على مجموعة من القيم والمبادئ والثوابت في تعاملاتها وعلاقاتها بشعوب العالم، حيث دأبت على توجيه عطائها الإنساني إلى المجتمعات المحتاجة بكل حيادية ودون تمييز، لترسخ مبادئ السلم والتآلف والتعاون بين الشعوب ودول العالم، وتتقاسم الأعباء الإنسانية مع مجتمعات المانحين، وتشاركهم سمو الهدف وسلامة المقصد في الحد من آثار الأزمات الإنسانية على الشعوب المتضررة، حيث تصدرت المملكة العربية السعودية الدول المانحة للدول المحتاجة على المستويين الإقليمي والدولي، وفي مقدمة هذه الدول اليمن الشقيق. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، إننا نجتمع اليوم واليمن يواجه أزمة إنسانية كبيرة، ويزيد من صعوبتها المعاناة الصحية والاقتصادية من جراء جائحة كوفيد-19 وما تقوم به الميليشيات الحوثية الانقلابية المدعومة من إيران من تصعيد كبير في اليمن، وبالأخص محافظة مأرب، والتي كانت ملاذا آمنا للنازحين في اليمن، بل إنها تجاوزت ذلك لتصعد عملها الإرهابي لتهدد دول الجوار، وهو ما يستوجب وقفة حازمة وصارمة من المجتمع الدولي لحماية الشعب اليمني الشقيق والوصول إلى حلول مستدامة تحقق الأمن والاستقرار والنماء لليمن وشعبه، وبالتالي للمنطقة والعالم أجمع. ورغم كل هذه التحديات والعوائق الصعبة، وتأكيدا لدور المملكة العربية السعودية الريادي وموقفها الثابت تجاه اليمن وشعبه النبيل، وحرصا منها على رفع المعاناة الإنسانية والصحية التي يتعرض لها الشعب اليمني الشقيق، يسرني أن أعلن التزام المملكة العربية السعودية بمبلغ 430 مليون دولار أمريكي لدعم خطة الاستجابة الإنسانية لليمن 2021 يتم تنفيذها من خلال المنظمات الأممية والدولية ومؤسسات المجتمع المدني المحلية والإقليمية. وفي الختام، تؤكد المملكة دعمها وحرصها على أمن واستقرار اليمن والمنطقة، والتزامها بدعم جميع الجهود الرامية للوصول إلى حل سياسي مستدام وفق المرجعيات الثلاث، وبما يضمن المحافظة على وحدة وسلامة اليمن وشعبه الشقيق. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I thank His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabia, and I would now like to hand over the moderation to His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Vice President of the Federal Council of Switzerland, to continue the proceedings.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I call on the next speaker, I ask you all to stick to the 3 minutes speaking time. We are pleased that we have over 50 speakers registered to deliver statements of support to Yemen today. I should now give the floor to Madame Dalia Kazem, Director for Social Development, Hodeida Girls Foundation. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak as local organizations working on the ground in Yemen. We share with you today the experiences of daily life as Yemenis. We, the ordinary people, displaced, affected, and poor, the children and women of Yemen. We carry a message to stop the war and let us live. A message from those laying in the streets with the sky as their blankets and the floor as their mattress. Their homes and life destroyed by the war. I deliver this message on behalf of the millions of families who have lost their relatives and livelihoods. These families include people like Abul Khatir, a Yemeni man suffering from the trauma of displacement and his inability to support his children. He attempted suicide many times and unfortunately succeeded. People like Faiza, a Yemeni woman who died of burn injuries sustained from a fire that erupted from petrol stored in her house. The fuel crisis has forced families to store petrol in their houses whenever people can access it on the market. And people like Ma'touq, a blind man who could not escape the war, living in fear of losing his life daily. Eventually, he was rescued, but he could not save the life of his young disabled son. We appeal to you on behalf of all these Yemenis to save their children, the children who are robbed of their childhoods and right of education, the innocent victims of this war. The women of Yemen are also carrying additional burdens and the escalating conflict. Relief workers are met with endless obstacles, and human rights defenders continue to fight for our rights. Who is protecting them? We as local organization witness the suffering of citizens firsthand, the tragic situation that happen every day. We are grateful for the assistance provided by international organizations, but it's only a temporary solution. Our concern as humanitarian organizations continues to grow, and the lack of funding remains the top obstacle. Local organizations and the humanitarian community need support and unhindered access to continue to work with integrity, enthusiasm, and determination. After 6 years of conflict, Yemen needs sustainable solution and to end the war to save millions of suffering Yemenis. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Kazem, Director for Social Development, Hodeya Guards Foundation, an important national NGO operating in Yemen, for your statement. I shall now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Heiko Maas, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Federal Republic of Germany. Heiko, du hast das Wort.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, excellencies, we just heard from the Secretary General, millions of people in Yemen are at risk of famine. It is the worst humanitarian disaster of our times. And what is even more devastating, the human suffering caused by the conflict is entirely man-made. Over the last weeks, the humanitarian situation has become even worse as a result of the latest Houthi offensive in Marib. Enough is enough. All parties to the conflict must immediately stop fighting and rally behind Martin Griffiths' initiative for a countrywide ceasefire, confidence-building measures, and the start of a comprehensive political process. Germany actively supports this through mediation and the United Nations Peace Support Facility. We also need to defend those who risk their own lives to save lives on the ground, humanitarian workers. Those who violate international humanitarian law by attacking civilian infrastructure must be held accountable. And we must put more pressure on those who continue to deny humanitarian access. They bear full responsibility for the suffering of the Yemeni people. It is our collective responsibility as donors to provide the necessary means to stop the disaster that is unfolding before our eyes. But it is the parties to the conflict that must finally end this war. Germany has been among the strongest supporters of the Yemeni people for years, providing humanitarian assistance, stabilization, and development to Yemen. We will further increase our humanitarian contribution this year and provide 200 million euros to the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan, 146 million of which have already been provided. In addition, Germany will continue its wide-ranging stabilization and development cooperation efforts. And we are counting on all of you to join us in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Heiko, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, for your statement. And I shall now give the floor to Her Excellency, Madam Reem bin Ibrahim Al-Hashimi, Minister of the State for International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellencies. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السادة الزملاء، يسعدني وبالنيابة عن دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة التقدم بجزيل الشكر والتقدير لأصحاب المعالي المضيفين والمنظمين للمؤتمر من حكومتي مملكة السويد والاتحاد السويسري ومن الأمم المتحدة، والشكر الخاص لدولة رئيس مجلس الوزراء اليمني معالي الأخ الدكتور معين عبد الملك سعيد. شأنها كشأننا جميعا اليوم، علقت دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة آمالا وطموحات عالية بعد التوصل إلى اتفاق ستوكهولم، والذي لو تم الالتزام بتنفيذه لما اقتضت الضرورة اجتماعنا اليوم لمناقشة الوضع الحرج الراهن في هذا العام. وترحب دولة الإمارات بتنفيذ اتفاق الرياض المبرم بين حكومة اليمن الشرعية والمجلس الانتقالي الجنوبي. السادة الكرام، أنهت دولة الإمارات مشاركتها العسكرية في اليمن عام 2019 بإيمان ثابت منها بقرب التوصل إلى حل سياسي للصراع تحت رعاية الأمم المتحدة يمكن اليمن من تحقيق تعاف اقتصادي وتيسير وصول الدعم الدولي دون عراقيل لمحاولة حل الأزمة الإنسانية القائمة والحيلولة دون استمرارها. ولا تزال تلك العقيدة راسخة في وجداننا، حيث أن التوصل إلى هذا الحل هو السبيل المستدام الوحيد لرسم مستقبل أفضل للشعب اليمني الشقيق. لذا نضم صوتنا للأصوات الداعمة الأخرى الداعية إلى التسوية الشاملة والالتزام بتحقيق السلام وبتوجيه الدعم الكامل لجهود المبعوث الخاص للأمم المتحدة إلى اليمن. السادة الكرام، ندين بأشد العبارات استهداف الميليشيات الحوثية بالصواريخ والطيارات المسيرة على الأماكن المدنية في المملكة العربية السعودية، وكذلك الهجمات الأخيرة على المدنيين في جنوب اليمن، والتي إن دلت فإنما تدل على نواياهم السيئة وعدم رغبتهم في الوصول إلى حل سلام في اليمن، حيث يشير رفض الحوثي للالتزام باتفاق ستوكهولم الموقع في ديسمبر 2018 وكذلك تعنتهم بشأن إتاحة الوصول الآمن لناقلة النفط الصافر إلى فداحة الوضع وإلى نيتهم المبيتة وأسلوبهم في تناول الأمور. وفي الوقت ذاته فإن الهجمات الإرهابية على وفد الحكومة اليمنية الجديدة في مطار عدن خلال الشهر الماضي وكذلك الهجوم المستمر على مأرب يتطلبان ضغطا دوليا جماعيا قوي بالإضافة إلى تنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن. قدمت سيداتي والسادة دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة مساعدات خارجية إلى اليمن تجاوزت 6 مليار دولار أمريكي منذ عام 2015، تركزت على دعم توفير الأغذية والخدمات الصحية والمياه. وفي عام 2020 فقد قدمنا 122 طن من الإمدادات والمستلزمات الطبية لدعم 122 ألف عامل في مجال الرعاية الصحية. في الختام يسرني أن أؤكد تعهد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة بتقديم 230 مليون دولار أمريكي لدعم الجهود الإنسانية في اليمن. شكراً والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I thank the Minister of the State for International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I shall now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Yanis Lenarčić, European Commissioner for Crisis Management. The floor is yours.
Very much, Vice President Cassis, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Nearly 6 years have passed since the present conflict in Yemen erupted. 6 years of unspeakable human suffering. And today, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But there is also now some hope for peace. The political momentum is accelerating. Progress, though, will depend on a collective and sustained effort from all involved. And we know that a political solution is the only solution for Yemen. In the meantime, the risk of famine is real, and we must strengthen our humanitarian response. But for that, there are 3 prerequisites that I wish to stress. First, the access. All parties must guarantee unrestricted access for humanitarian aid and humanitarian workers. All parties must respect the international humanitarian law. This is an issue of life or death for millions of Yemenis. Second, to defeat famine and to assist Yemen effectively, we must stop the economic drivers fueling the crisis. The restriction of imports and the weaponization of basic commodities, such as food and fuel, are clear violations of international humanitarian law and may constitute war crimes. And technical measures to improve imports, currency stability, and payment of salaries must be supported at the political level by all parties. And finally, humanitarian funding needs to be stepped up. This is why the European Union is mobilizing an additional 95 million euro in humanitarian aid for Yemen this year. This will help provide assistance to those affected by the conflict, with a focus on displaced persons, as well as those in need of food assistance, nutrition, and critical health care. And while we are not yet in a position to announce our 2021 development funding, the EU will remain also engaged as an important development actor in Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lenarčić, European Commissioner for Crisis Management, for your statement. I should now give the floor to His Excellency Sheikh Dr. Ahmed Nasser Al-Mohammed Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Kuwait. The floor is yours, Minister.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. معالي السيد إغنازيو كاسيس نائب رئيس وزير خارجية الاتحاد السويسري، معالي السيدة آنا ليندا وزيرة خارجية مملكة السويد، معالي السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يطيب لي أن أتقدم بالشكر على الدعوة للمشاركة في الاجتماع لمناقشة الأزمة في اليمن في ظل ظروف بالغة الدقة وتماشيا مع خطة الاستجابة الإنسانية للعام 2021. كما لا يفوتني التقدم بالشكر لحكومة المملكة العربية السعودية الشقيقة على استضافتها الناجحة للمؤتمر السابق في يونيو 2020. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، لم تخطئ الأمم المتحدة في توصيفها للأوضاع في اليمن حين أكدت بأنها أسوأ أزمة إنسانية يشهدها العالم، حيث زاد من سوءها تفشي وباء جائحة كورونا ليضفي تحديات جديدة في نقص الغذاء وانتشار الأمراض وتواصل الإعاقة المتعمدة للمساعدات الإنسانية، إضافة لارتفاع مستويات العنف وموجات جديدة للجوء والنزوح في ظل تواضع البنى الصحية والاقتصادية. ولقد شهدنا في السنوات الماضية تضافرا للجهود الدولية عبر المشاركة الفاعلة في مؤتمرات المانحين تماشيا مع تزايد الاحتياجات الإنسانية الملحة للشعب اليمني الشقيق، مع استمرار الأزمة لعامها السابع لتؤتي تلك الجهود تأكيدا على المسؤولية الدولية الجماعية لدعم خطط الاستجابة الإنسانية. تلك الجهود التي كانت دولة الكويت جزءا منها عبر دعمها المتواصل لليمن في المجالات الإنسانية والتنموية، حيث بلغ إجمالي ما قدمته في تلك المجالات ما يفوق $1,559 مليون، منها $850 مليون في المجال الإنساني منذ عام 2015، مؤكدين استمرارنا بدعم الأشقاء في اليمن من أجل معالجة هذه الأزمة. وبناء على توجيهات سيدي حضرة صاحب السمو أمير البلاد الشيخ نواف الأحمد الجابر الصباح حفظه الله ورعاه، واستجابة للاحتياجات الإنسانية الإغاثية العاجلة للشعب اليمني الشقيق، تقدم دولة الكويت دعما لمدة عامين ب$20 مليون أمريكي، وذلك من الموارد المتاحة للصندوق الكويتي للتنمية الاقتصادية العربية. وتجدر الإشارة هنا إلى جهود دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية في الإعداد لمؤتمر دولي لإعادة إعمار اليمن ووضع برنامج عملي لتأهيل الاقتصاد اليمني وتسهيل اندماجه مع الاقتصاد الخليجي، وذلك بعد وصول الأطراف اليمنية إلى الحل السياسي المنشود. متمنيا لمؤتمركم كل النجاح والتوفيق، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Kuwait for his statement. Shukran. I would now like to hand over the moderation to His Excellency Mr. Per Olsson Frid, Minister for International Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of Sweden, to continue the proceedings. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Cassis. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, it's a pleasure to join you today as a co-host and moderator of this event. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Mohammed Al-Sayed, Executive Director for Nahda Makers Organization, one of the national non-governmental organizations operating in Yemen. Mr. Al-Sayed, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. We are Nahda Makers Organization, representing Yemeni civil society organizations working to respond to the needs of the people in Yemen. I would like first to thank you and all those who work to make this pledging event happen and take this opportunity to welcome everyone. Driven by conflict, disease, economic collapse, and the breakdown of public institutions and services, Yemen is among the poorest countries in the world. According to the UN reports, Yemen is suffering the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, with more than 20 million people, which is 66% of the population, are estimated to need humanitarian assistance in 2021. The numbers are probably shocking to you, but we, alongside other national civil society organizations, every day meet the people behind these numbers, feel and experience firsthand what these numbers mean. The war affected every aspect of life, bringing people to a breaking point. As prices soar, people's savings have run out. They have exhausted their coping mechanisms. Displacement has heightened protection risk, including violence against women and girls. Children continue to be affected by the conflict and haunted by malnutrition, while the damage and closure of schools and hospitals has disrupted access to education and health services, leaving children even more vulnerable and depriving them of their dreams. And now, with COVID-19 spreading, Yemen is facing an emergency within an emergency. Sanitation and clean water are in a short supply. Public institutions are struggling to respond to the increasing demand with scarce resources due to neglect because of the war and increasing number of internally displaced people. This is what more than 5 years of conflict have done to Yemen. This was lately worsened by the underfunding challenge that humanitarian actors faced. We believe that there is a need to focus on the work needed to coherently address people's vulnerability before, during, and after crisis. Together, we need to make interventions more profound by building on local capacities and strengthening communities. We encourage to adopt innovative approaches and focus on humanitarian development nexus that involve achieving collective outcomes that reduce need, risk, and vulnerability over multiple years. Our ultimate goal should be to help vulnerable communities to support themselves. National CSOs represent the interpretation of the new approach of helping the Yemeni people stand on their own. Being close to the population, Yemeni CSOs are the best place to assess their needs. In addition, they have been and continue to be at the forefront of the delivery of services, even in the most difficult circumstances. We, on behalf of local civil society organizations, call for greater commitment to the Grand Bargain Agreement and greater empowerment of national organizations. We advocate that CSOs play a more active role and participate in decision-making process, peace building, reconstruction, and development in Yemen. Through more engagement of the national CSOs in the humanitarian interventions, Yemeni people can take ownership of their development and growth. Finally, I urge all of us to translate our participation here today into action, pledge our donations, time and mostly hearts to elevate Yemen's situation. And remember that the lives of Yemeni children, women, and men depend on your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank the Executive Director of the Nada Makers Organization for his important statement. And I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to a dear colleague, Her Excellency Ms. Karina Gold, Minister of International Development from Canada. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here with all of you, and a special thank you to dear friend, Minister Olsen-Fried from Sweden. Your Excellencies, Mr. Lowcock, colleagues and partners, thank you for bringing us together to collectively respond to needs in Yemen. In the face of what is regrettably characterized as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, let me thank our partners at the forefront responding to this crisis. You are leaders working daily to ensure that emergency relief reaches those in need. Since the beginning of the conflict in 2015, the people of Yemen have suffered through violence, displacement, near famine, flooding, and outbreaks of cholera, dengue, malaria, and diphtheria. And for the last year, COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities, magnified suffering, and impeded efforts to reach those who need help the most. On top of all of this, the rise in food insecurity and malnutrition throughout the country have reached untenable levels. We, as donors and humanitarians, must step up our efforts. The time to act is now, and we must act on many fronts. That is why Canada will contribute $69.9 million to respond to the humanitarian needs of conflict-affected people in Yemen. We will be providing this funding early and ensuring that it is largely unearmarked so that partners, including UN agencies, the Red Cross, and NGOs can immediately and flexibly respond to the most urgent needs of the population, delivering life-saving food and nutrition, and providing much-needed healthcare, clean water, and sanitation. But to reach those who need the most help, to provide the essential services that are so crucial to saving lives, humanitarian workers must have safe and rapid access to affected communities. Parties to the conflict must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of civilians as well as humanitarian and medical personnel. Any and all restrictions impeding humanitarian assistance must be removed immediately. Canada calls on all parties to find a permanent end to this conflict and to build inclusive and sustainable peace. We support the efforts of the Special Envoy to the Secretary General and have invested over $22 million in peace and security assistance. The suffering in Yemen must end, and the rights and dignity of the people, especially civilians, women, children, and other vulnerable populations, must be protected. Canada is here today to do our part to help make this happen. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of International Development of Canada for your statement and your contribution. And I hereby give the floor to Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Programme. David, the floor is yours.
Well, it's good to see you again, and it's great to be here with everybody. I certainly wish we could not have this conference, but unfortunately, we're having to do this so often because the crisis is so great. We averted famine already a couple times in Yemen because each and every one of you stepped up over the last few years. But here we are again in a very bad crisis situation. And I want to say first a very special thank you to the United States for the designation of unlisting with regards to the terrorist list. Because as you know, and I don't need to reiterate all of the numbers that everybody's been talking, they're really not good. But when the United States did what it did in delisting, we were looking at going from 16 million people marching to the brink of starvation out of 29 to 24 million. So you can imagine the crisis we would be facing now had that delisting not take place. So thank you for that. Now we need to move toward pressure of all of us working together to bring this conflict to an end. In the meantime, as many of you have said, we got famine knocking on the door. You've got 5 million people at IPC level 4. That's just horrific. 5 million people. 11 million at PC level 3. This is emergency crisis level. And if we don't get the funds that we need, you're going to have massive famine throughout the country. Literally hundreds of thousands of children will die, millions of people will die. But it's all avoidable. We need the support. So all of you that are stepping up now, thank you very much. Let me just give you a little figure of the reality of how much money we need just to avert famine is 1.9 billion. You see, we feed 13 million people on any given day, week, or month. And that's a lot of money to feed 13 million. Unfortunately, because of lack of access and lack of funds, we're now supporting a part of that 13 million are only getting about 9 million out of that 13 are getting half rations. So you can see with the coping capacity, the economic deterioration, the protracted war and conflict, people are at the bottom of the bottom. As the Secretary General said, literally a death sentence is knocking on the door of the families, the children, the innocent victims of this conflict. So we are assisting about 13 million people. To avert famine, we need literally $1.6 billion, $1.9 billion just to avert famine. You can do the math. That's about $160 million per month. To have full rations is about $20 million. I mean, $200 million per month. So $160 million per month is what we need to avert famine. $200 million for full rations. At this stage, we've got $310 million of what we need for 2021. Do the math. It's not good. This is why this pledging conference is so extremely vital, so we can avert famine, save lives, and that's what the children and the family and the people of Yemen need and, quite frankly, deserve. So please, step up. Let's end the war. Continue to partner with us as we continue to save lives throughout the land of Yemen with hopefully a better future and end of the war. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your statement, and also to you and all your colleagues working tirelessly in Yemen and elsewhere, saving lives in the hardest to reach areas. You deserve all of the respect from everyone attending this event today. I shall now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Washio Eiichiro, Minister of State of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
I am Washio Eiichiro, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. I would like to thank the government of Sweden, the government of Switzerland, and the United Nations for organizing this event. We would also like to express our respect for UN and other aid workers who are operating under the extremely difficult environment. Long-standing conflict in Yemen has been causing the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The international community must continue supporting the people of Yemen who are facing imminent danger of famine and infectious diseases. Japan, as a major donor country, will continue to contribute to improving the humanitarian situation in Yemen. In 2020, we pledged $41.2 million of assistance to Yemen in areas such as food, refugees, and health, and we have disbursed all of them by the end of the year. Under the principles of human security, and in accordance with the leaving no one behind policy of the SDGs, Japan has already decided to provide at least $49 million in 2021. We hope that this assistance will continue to contribute to the mitigation of the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 and the food crisis in Yemen, helping Yemeni refugees and strengthening its health systems. In addition, Japan will continue its own support of investing in people with the aim of medium and long-term development of Yemen. We will resume initiatives such as human resource development training by JICA and Japanese government scholarships, taking COVID-19 situation into consideration. In order to end the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, now is the time to heighten the momentum towards a political solution and of the parties to take constructive steps. There is no military solution to the Yemeni conflict, but a political solution through dialogue among Yemeni people. From this perspective, the government of Japan supports all the efforts by Mr. Martin Griffiths, Special Envoy of UN Secretary General. Taking this opportunity, Japan again calls on all parties for immediate ceasefire and early start of dialogue for political solution to the situation in Yemen. Japan strongly condemns repeated cross-border attacks against civilian infrastructure by the Houthis. These attacks must be stopped immediately, and impending humanitarian efforts is unacceptable. Japan remains committed to continuously making both humanitarian and political efforts in cooperation with countries concerned to realize peace and stability in Yemen.
I thank the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Japan for his statement, and I shall now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sultan bin Saad Al Muraki, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. Minister, sir, the floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سيد الرئيس، أصحاب السعادة، الزملاء، أود بداية أن أتقدم بالشكر لكل من سعادة السيد أنطوني غوتيريش الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، وسعادة السيد إغناسيوس كاسيس نائب رئيس سويسرا ورئيس الوزارة الاتحادية للشؤون الخارجية، وسعادة السيدة آن ليندي وزيرة خارجية السويد على رعاية هذا الحدث الرفيع المستوى الذي يعكس التزام المجتمع الدولي المستمر بالوفاء بمسؤولياته الإنسانية وتسهيل وصول المساعدات إلى المحتاجين إليها في اليمن. وفي هذا الصدد فإن دولة قطر واظبت باستمرار على تقديم الدعم لشعب اليمن الشقيق لمساعدته على تجاوز الصعوبات الإنسانية التي تثقل الكاهلة في الوقت الذي لا زال يتطلع إلى ما يستحقه من السلام والاستقرار والخروج من الأزمة كبلد مزدهر وآمن. وهنا نعرب مجددا دعم دولة قطر للمبادرات والجهود التي تبذلها الأمم المتحدة ممثلة بالمبعوث الخاص للأمين العام إلى اليمن لدفع الحل عبر الحوار، ونؤكد أهمية السعي لإنهاء الأزمة من خلال التفاوض بين اليمنيين بموجب مخرجات الحوار الوطني والمبادرة الخليجية والالتزام بقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة وخاصة القرار 2216 بغية تحقيق السلام المستدام والتنمية وتحسين الوضع الإنساني في اليمن. ونغتنم هذه الفرصة لنثني على الدور المحوري لمكتب تنسيق المساعدات الإنسانية والشركاء الدوليين العاملين في المجال الإنساني لما يقومون به من جهود لا غنى عنها على نطاق واسع وفي ظل تحديات كبيرة. وكما هو معلوم فإن دولة قطر في مقدمة الدول الداعمة لمكتب الأمم المتحدة لتنسيق المساعدات الإنسانية. فيما يتعلق بالدعم الإنمائي لليمن، بلغ إجمالي المساعدات المقدمة من دولة قطر لليمن في الفترة من 2013 إلى 2020 ما يقارب 195 مليون دولار أمريكي. نذكر بعضا مما قدمته دولة قطر في مجال المساعدات الإنسانية، حيث تعهدت دولة قطر بمبلغ 70 مليون دولار، تم صرف مبلغ 10 مليون دولار من قبل صندوق قطر للتنمية في قطاع المياه والصرف الصحي، حيث تم تخصيص دعم لبرنامج تعزيز المياه والإصحاح بالتعاون مع منظمة اليونيسف منذ عام 2018 في اليمن لمدة 3 سنوات. كما يتم توفير دعم مشروع صندوق الأمم المتحدة للسكان بمبلغ وقدره 5 مليون دولار أمريكي، وتم صرف منها 1,800,000 دولار أمريكي لصالح ما يقارب 800,000 مستفيد في قطاع الصحة. أما في قطاع المأوى فقد تم تخصيص دعم لمشروع من قبل برنامج الأمم المتحدة للمستوطنات البشرية بمبلغ 2 مليون دولار أمريكي. وختاما نجدد تقديرنا لجميع الدول والجهات التي تعمل بجد للوفاء بالمسؤولية الدولية على مد يد المساعدة لليمن واليمنيين. شاكر لكم حسن الاستماع.
I thank the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar for his statement, and I would now like to hand over the moderation back to Mr. Mark Lowcock, Undersecretary General, Emergency Relief Coordinator, to continue the proceedings. Mark, the floor is yours.
Per, thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you, please, to restrict your remarks to a maximum of 3 minutes. I'm pleased now to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jens Frölich Holter, State Secretary at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Norway.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 6 years of relentless conflict in Yemen have devastated the lives of millions of people. The human suffering is enormous. The only way to resolve this humanitarian crisis is through inclusive political solution to the conflict. With millions of Yemenis at the risk of starvation, it is crucial to ensure sufficient funding for the humanitarian response. I would like to thank the UN, Sweden and Switzerland for this important meeting, and we are already starting to see tangible results. I would like to make 3 quick points. Firstly, the humanitarian crisis will continue to deepen unless there is an end to the violence. We are alarmed by the recent escalation of fighting in Yemen, including the offensive in Mideast, which threatens to increase the number of internally displaced people dramatically. We are also concerned about the situation in Hodeida. Norway stands firmly behind the efforts of the UN Special Envoy. We urge the parties to engage in a ceasefire and seek political consultations. It is essential to include women in all humanitarian and political efforts. Secondly, we urge the parties in the conflict to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. This includes ensuring safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need. Protection must be at the core of all humanitarian response. Protecting civilians, especially children, is a prerequisite for achieving a sustainable solution to the conflict. Those responsible for violations must be held accountable. And lastly, Norway gives high priority to the humanitarian response in Yemen. And I'm pleased to announce a contribution of 200 million Norwegian kroner for humanitarian assistance in 2021. Further contributions will be considered. In addition, Norway provides substantial core funding to key humanitarian organizations and is among the top donors to the Central Emergency Response Fund. This year, we have also increased our core contributions to the World Food Programme by 167% compared to last year, and to UNHCR by 80% compared to last year. Increased flexibility enables the organizations to respond to the acute food and protection crisis in Yemen. So let me conclude by thanking our humanitarian partners for their invaluable efforts on the ground under extremely difficult circumstances. Thank you. Shukran.
I thank the State Secretary for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. James Cleverly, Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. I would like to thank the United Nations, Sweden and Switzerland for hosting this conference. To all those generously pledging funding today, your contributions will make a profound difference to the lives of Yemeni people. The Yemen conflict is now in its 6th year, and as we enter 2021, with the country in imminent danger of the worst famine in decades, we must ensure that our response reaches the most vulnerable Yemenis, while we do everything we can to bring an end to the conflict. This is the only sustainable way to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. Given the enormous scale of the challenge, and as David Beasley said, with 16 million at risk of starvation, we must ensure that aid is getting to those who need it most. And we encourage humanitarian actors to improve monitoring and collection of data to enable more flexible and agile response. Further prioritisation is also needed so that those in most need receive the help first, and so that no group is systematically excluded. Severe restrictions are still preventing the effective delivery of aid and stopping it from reaching the people who need it. And this means vulnerable people get less aid. In a context of famine risk, it is completely unacceptable. The current unprecedented restrictions on humanitarian access must be lifted. To respond to the crisis, the UK will provide at least £87 million to Yemen over the course of the next financial year, bringing the UK's contribution since the start of this conflict to over £1 billion. With this funding, UK assistance will prioritise those most vulnerable and at the highest risk. It will provide at least 1.6 million people with access to clean drinking water, support 400 clinics to offer primary health care, and feed 240,000 of the most vulnerable Yemenis every month. We will continue to invest in data and analysis to ensure that the UN-led response knows where to help and who requires help, and targeted to those that need it most. Ultimately, only a permanent ceasefire will prevent the humanitarian situation from becoming a catastrophe. It is of grave concern that the Houthis have launched a new offensive on Marib, a city where OCHA estimates 1 million Yemenis have sought refuge since the beginning of the war. I condemn these attacks, which will only make a dire humanitarian situation worse. All sides must constructively engage with the UN and seize the opportunity for peace. To conclude, recent global challenges have meant a difficult financial context for us all. However, we all have a part to play in supporting the people of Yemen. Funding committed today must be dispersed quickly to avoid further suffering, and we must better target our response to those who need it most. Yemen's leaders must now engage constructively with the United Nations and agree a nationwide ceasefire and the path to an inclusive political settlement. Peace is the only way out of this terrible conflict and the only way to alleviate the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
I thank the Minister of State for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Flemming Møller Mortensen, Minister for Development Cooperation of the Kingdom of Denmark.
The humanitarian situation in Yemen is deeply tragic, the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. I'm truly concerned about the danger of widespread famine and about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm concerned for the women and the girls of Yemen who are affected the worst by the crisis. We need to strengthen our humanitarian efforts in Yemen. Funding and access are essential. And we need to redouble our push for long-term solutions to the conflict. I call on all parties to be part of a sustainable ceasefire and support the UN-led efforts for an inclusive political solution to the conflict. I also call on all parties to ensure humanitarian access with immediate effects and respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. There must be no constraints on humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian organizations must be allowed full and free access to those in need. Against this background, I hereby announce a pledge of $20.4 million in new funding for 2021 for life-saving humanitarian activities in Yemen. The funding will be provided through the UN Yemen Humanitarian Fund, UNICEF, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, along with civil society organizations. Overall, Denmark has contributed funding of $145 million to humanitarian actions in Yemen since the start of the conflict in 2015. Finally, I would like to share my sincere appreciations of the work of all frontline staff delivering humanitarian assistance in Yemen, often in extremely difficult and dangerous conditions. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for his statement, and I now give the floor to Ms. Mariette Schuurman, Director of the Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mark. And let me begin by thanking our host for organizing this conference at a critical time for the Yemeni people. I'm sorry, it's my dog barking in the background. Many speakers before me have highlighted the unimaginable hardships the Yemeni have to endure and the devastating impact of more than 5 years of conflict and economic collapse, including on the mental and psychosocial resilience of the Yemeni people. And this cannot be highlighted too often. We have a responsibility to act. Hence, I take this opportunity to once again confirm that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is on top of our agenda, and that we remain committed to finding a political solution while at the same time addressing the immense needs. The crisis in Yemen has the full attention of our political leadership. Our Minister for Development Cooperation, Sigrid Kaag, had asked me to convey her unwavering commitment to the Yemeni people. We will stay actively engaged in humanitarian diplomacy, both at the political level and through our embassy network. It is essential to keep the humanitarian situation in Yemen on the international agenda and at the same time make a real difference for the people in Yemen. Today, our attention goes out to the millions of Yemeni on the brink of starvation. All alarm bells have rung for the past months, and we need joint efforts to prevent massive conflict-induced famine, for which you, Mark, warned the UN Security Council already in January. We therefore urge all parties to take their responsibility beyond ensuring sufficient funding for food assistance. We commit to continue addressing this issue in international platforms and in our dialogue with the authorities. We stand united with the UN, international and national aid organizations, and other donors in demanding that all parties to the conflict address the unacceptable restrictions on aid delivery and ensure unimpeded access for humanitarian aid. We welcome the strong leadership and coordination of the UN and express our full support for the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths and Humanitarian and Resident Coordinator David Grassley and their respective mandates. Finally, we would like to confirm our continued financial support to the humanitarian response in Yemen. I'm pleased to announce an initial contribution for 2021 of 18 million euros, of which 12 million through the Yemen Humanitarian Fund and 6 million through the Dutch Relief Alliance. And this funding comes, of course, on top of unearmarked funding to humanitarian partners and modalities such as the SURF. Our funding is flexible so that it can be used by our partners immediately and as they see fit, and we encourage other donors to also commit to flexible funding modalities. The people of Yemen can count on our unwavering support. Thank you, Mark.
I thank the Director for her statement, and I now give the floor to Dr. Naif Falah Al-Hajraf, who is the Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council for the Arab states of the Gulf. Excellency, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. معالي السيد أنطوني كوتيريس أمين عام الأمم المتحدة، السيد كاسياس نائب الرئيس وزير الخارجية الاتحاد الفدرالي السويسري، معالي السيدة آن لندي وزير خارجية مملكة السويد، السيد مارك لوكوك وكيل أمين الأمم المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية منسق لإغاثة في حالات طوارئ. سيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. تقدم بداية بالشكر للجهود المبذولة لتنظيم هذا المؤتمر بالشراكة بين الأمم المتحدة ومملكة السويد والاتحاد الفدرالي السويسري، وذلك لحشد الدعم اللازم لتمويل خطة الاستجابة الإنسانية لليمن، وهو ما يشير بوضوح إلى اهتمام المجتمع الدولي بالأزمة اليمنية الناتجة عن انقلاب الحوثي المدعوم من إيران على الشرعية في الجمهورية اليمنية وتداعياتها الإنسانية. ينعقد هذا الاجتماع اليوم افتراضيا بسبب الظروف الصعبة التي يواجهها العالم بأسره جراء جائحة كورونا وما ترتب على ذلك من صعوبات اقتصادية وصحية وسياسية. نعرب عن تقديرنا للوفود المشاركة من الحكومات والمنظمات لجهودها المخلصة في دعم الجهود الأممية لمساعدة الشعب اليمني وإنهاء الأزمة اليمنية، ارتكازاً على المرجعيات الثلاث المتمثلة بالمبادرة الخليجية وآليتها التنفيذية ومخرجات الحوار الوطني وقرار مجلس الأمن 22/16. كما نشكر مبادرة المملكة العربية السعودية وحكومة خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك سلمان بن عبد العزيز آل سعود بتنظيم مؤتمر المانحين لليمن الذي عقد افتراضياً في 2 من شهر يونيو 2020. السيدات والسادة، يتزامن انعقاد هذا المؤتمر مع بروز تحديات طارئة على واجهة المشهد الإنساني في اليمن جراء استمرار ميليشيات الحوثي المدعومة من إيران بالتصعيد العسكري وإعاقة كافة الجهود والمساعي الهادفة إلى التهدئة وإتاحة الأجواء المواتية لدفع المسار السياسي الهادف إلى التوصل لتسوية سياسية تنهي الحرب وتضع حداً لمعاناة الشعب اليمني. كما قامت هذه الميليشيات بالاستيلاء على إيرادات رسوم استيراد المنشآت النفطية من الحساب الخاص للبنك المركزي بمدينة الحديدة والمخصص لدفع مرتبات موظفي الخدمة المدنية. كما لا تزال الميليشيات تعيق جهود الفريق الفني التابع للأمم المتحدة لفحص خزان النفط العائم صافر، مما يهدد بكارثة اقتصادية وبيئية تتعدى المنطقة والإقليم. وفي هذا المقام أود أن ألفت نظر المجتمع الدولي إلى ما تقوم به الميليشيات الحوثية حالياً من فظائع وانتهاكات بحق المدنيين والنازحين واللاجئين في محافظة مأرب، حيث أفرزت تداعيات الأزمة اليمنية ورفض جماعة الحوثي لخيار التسوية السياسية إلى أوضاع إنسانية كارثية في اليمن، حيث بات ما يقدر ب 80% من السكان بحاجة لمساعدات إنسانية، فيما يعاني أكثر من 24 مليون شخص من إجمالي السكان من نقص الاحتياجات الأساسية، كما يخيم شبح المجاعة على كافة أنحاء اليمن، إلى جانب انتشار الأوبئة والأمراض ونزوح أكثر من 3 ملايين شخص. السيدات والسادة، لقد حرصت دول مجلس التعاون ولا تزال على إيلاء الجوانب المتعلقة بالاحتياجات الإنسانية في اليمن اهتماماً بالغاً، سواء من خلال موائمة اتجاهات الدعم الإنساني والإغاثي والاقتصادي والتنموي المقدم من دول المجلس مع أولويات الاحتياجات الإنسانية اليمنية، سواء عبر تمويل تنفيذ الكثير من المشاريع والبرامج الإنمائية والإغاثية المرتبطة بالاحتياجات الأساسية للسكان في المناطق المتضررة، أو من خلال تكثيف أنشطة الجمعيات والهيئات الحكومية والأهلية الناشطة في المجالات الإنسانية والإغاثية التابعة لدول المجلس في تمويل الكثير من المشاريع والبرامج ذات الطابع الإنساني والإغاثي التي تهدف إلى تخفيف معاناة الشعب اليمني الشقيق، حيث بلغت مساهمات دول مجلس التعاون استجابة للخطة الإنسانية أكثر من 28 مليار دولار أمريكي منذ 2006. سيدات والسادة، نتطلع في مجلس التعاون أن يتم التوصل إلى الحل السياسي المبني على المرجعيات الثلاث لإنهاء الحرب الدائرة واستعادة اليمن وشعبه الكريم للأمن والاستقرار. أن تسارع الأحداث على الأرض وكذلك في الجوانب السياسية يتطلب منا جميعا التفكير في مرحلة ما بعد التوصل إلى الحل السياسي لتعزيز الأمن ودفع جهود التنمية والاقتصاد والمتطلبات الإنسانية في اليمن. وعليه يسعدنا أن نعلن عن تنظيم الأمانة العامة لمجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية لعدد من ورش العمل لتنسيق جهود التنمية وإعادة الإعمار وتعافي الاقتصاد، وذلك خلال عام 2021 بالتعاون مع الشركاء والدول وحكومات العالم، تمهيداً لانعقاد المؤتمر الدولي لإعادة إعمار اليمن وفقاً لقرار مقام المجلس الأعلى لمجلس التعاون في 2015، وذلك بعد التوصل إلى الحل السياسي. شكراً على التنظيم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I thank the Secretary-General for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sang-Wook Ham, Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs of the Republic of Korea.
Allow me to begin by expressing my appreciation to the co-hosts for convening this important conference in the midst of a global pandemic. The protracted humanitarian crisis in the Republic of Yemen, exacerbated by the ongoing conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic, has put millions of Yemenis in a dire situation. We all know that finding a peaceful solution for the conflict is critical to ending the suffering. The Republic of Korea calls on all parties to cease hostilities and engage in the international efforts to build peace across the country. This is a critical moment where we can either get closer to peace or push it further away. The nationwide humanitarian needs in Yemen call for our consolidated and immediate support. This year, the Korean government will provide more than $19 million in humanitarian assistance. This includes our support to both the Yemen Humanitarian Fund and the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan. As part of this contribution, we will also provide 18,000 tons of rice to address the worst ever food insecurity and a looming famine in the country. In addition to the efforts to address immediate humanitarian needs, the international community should provide greater support for long-term measures that would promote sustainable development in Yemen. The Republic of Korea, for its part, is providing assistance for a project in cooperation with the UNDP to enhance inclusive governance. Strengthening international cooperation is paramount to finally end COVID-19. Therefore, in addition to the test kits that we provided to Yemenis last year, we will contribute to ensuring equitable access to vaccines under the COVAX facility. Humanitarian indicators released at the beginning of this year show that the humanitarian situation in Yemen will only get worse. Now is the time for the international community to step up for the 24 million Yemenis in need. I thank you very much.
I thank the Deputy Minister for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Al-Bulgait, Secretary General of the League of Arab States.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. في الأيام الأخيرة نزح عشرات الآلاف من مأرب هربا من تجدد القتال. هذه المحافظة التي تقع شمال شرق العاصمة صنعاء تضم ما بين 1,200,000 نازح ومشرد يمني لجأوا إليها فرارا من ويلات الصراع. يعيش هؤلاء في نحو 90 مخيما للاجئين، ويشكلون نحو 60% من جملة اللاجئين في اليمن. فقد كان ينظر إلى مأرب خلال سنوات النزاع بوصفها مكانا آمنا نسبيا بالمقارنة بالمناطق الأخرى. وكما تعلمون جميعا فقد تعرضت مأرب منذ 7 فبراير الماضي لهجمات تصعيدية عنيفة من قبل جماعة الحوثي بهدف السيطرة عليها ونهب مواردها الطبيعية. إن هذه الهجمات الخطيرة التي تباشرها الميليشيات الحوثية قد تؤدي إلى فرار جماعي من مدينة مأرب، وثمة خطر حقيقي بأن يتعرض السكان المدنيون لعمليات انتقام إذا نجح الحوثيون في السيطرة على المدينة. ويبدو واضحا أن الهجمات الأخيرة تستهدف تحسين الوضع التفاوضي لجماعة الحوثي في استجابة لرغبات وإشارات طرف إقليمي هو إيران. وهذه الهجمات تعد تذكيرا لنا جميعا بأن الأزمة الإنسانية التي يعيشها اليمن هي أزمة من صنع الإنسان، وهناك أطراف بعينها تتحمل المسؤولية عنه. وما يحدث في مأرب اليوم على فداحته ليس سوى صورة مصغرة من المأساة التي يعيشها اليمنيون في ربوع البلاد شمالا وجنوبا. لقد شاهدنا جميعا صور الأطفال منتفخي البطون وهي تغزو الفضائيات مستصرخة ضمائر المجتمع الدولي. إننا على بعد خطوات من مجاعة تعيد إلى الأذهان مشاهد وصورا اختفت منذ سنوات. لا يمكن السماح بمجاعة جديدة تحدث تحت بصرنا. علينا أن نتحرك وبسرعة لمواجهة وضع قد يتطور إلى ما هو أسوأ. فهناك 5 مليون على بعد خطوة واحدة من المجاعة، وهناك 400 ألف طفل يمني يتضورون جوعا وفقا لمقولاتكم جميعا. إن خطورة الوضع الإنساني لا ينبغي أن تصرفنا عن السبب الأصلي وراء تفجره على هذا النحو، وهو استمرار العمليات العسكرية. إننا نطالب بوقف العمليات العسكرية في كافة هذا البلد، ونطلب من جماعة الحوثي وقف هجماتها في مأرب بشكل فوري، ووقف ضرباتها الصاروخية الموجهة ضد المملكة العربية السعودية، والامتثال لهدنة إنسانية تسمح بمعالجة آثار كارثة إنسانية غير مسبوقة في هذا القرن. ونؤكد أخيرا أن الحل السياسي الشامل الذي ينطلق من قرار مجلس الأمن 2216 هو وحده الكفيل بمعالجة الأزمة اليمنية بكافة أبعادها، بما في ذلك جانبها الإنساني الخطير والملح. شكرا لكم سيادة الرئيس.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ireland.
I want to thank OCHA, Sweden and Switzerland for arranging today's event. For the people of Yemen, the alarm bells have never been ringing as loudly as they are today. The UN system has been warning clearly of the risk of famine, that the country is now speeding towards it. The World Food Programme estimates that there are 350,000 Yemenis on the verge of famine, and as many as 5 million in places threatened by famine. The roots of this crisis lie in conflict, and we support strongly the political process led by UN Special Envoy Martin Griffith. As a member of the UN Security Council, Ireland will press this case, which offers the only meaningful way forward. The increased risk of famine now threatens a catastrophic situation and makes these efforts all the more urgent. We call on all parties to take action to halt the disaster unfolding before our eyes. It is essential that the world responds to provide humanitarian assistance to the people who are facing multiple threats to their well-being, from conflict, disease, flooding, and collapsed economy and hunger. And there must be full, unfettered, safe access for humanitarian workers to all parts of Yemen. We salute the commitment of the humanitarian workers who seek to alleviate this suffering. Their courage was tragically highlighted in late December with the killings and injuries suffered by ICRC staff at Aden Airport. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We encourage all donors who have assisted Yemen in the past to continue to do so now, or to recommence their aid. The spectre of famine has a particular haunting resonance for us in Ireland, and in 2021 we will play our part in supporting humanitarian assistance to Yemen. We will allocate now €5 million to the OCHA pooled fund, and as we did in 2020, we will look for further opportunities to contribute to the fund. Additionally, Ireland remains fully committed to the multilateral response to the situation in Yemen, notably through CERF, where Ireland is one of the top 10 donors. Yemen is home to the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and while the search for a political solution continues, we cannot lose time in addressing the devastating consequences of the conflict for the 24 million in urgent need of assistance.
I thank the Minister, for his statement, and I now give the floor to Henrietta Fore, the Executive Director of UNICEF.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the generosity of all of the donors. Every bit of your assistance is desperately needed. It is now 6 years of the conflict in Yemen. Children are the most affected by the conflict, and it is not of their making. The ongoing hostilities in Hodeidah and Mareb are further worsening the situation of children and their families, including having to flee their homes with barely anything. Across Yemen, children face an ever-growing threat of malnutrition, preventable diseases, and an uncertain future. No aspect of a child's life has been spared from the consequences of the conflict. Almost every child in Yemen, over 12 million, now needs humanitarian assistance. Acute malnutrition has emerged as a potent threat. Nearly 2.3 million, 2 out of 5 children under the age of 5 are now at risk of acute malnutrition in 2021, including what you have been hearing, nearly 400,000 of severe acute malnutrition. These children are likely to die if they do not get urgent treatment. These are among the highest levels seen in Yemen since 2015, when violence escalated. It is a race against time. We need to act, and we need to act fast, collectively. Children are bearing a disproportionate toll of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It is a dangerous combination of armed conflict, of poverty, economic decline, and COVID-19 pandemic. All the basic services on which children depend are collapsing. Schools, hospitals, water, and nutrition. Exhausted families are resorting to negative coping mechanisms, including compromising the quality and quantity of the food that they eat. The hopes of children in Yemen are on us, all of us. For millions of them and their families, our assistance is the difference between life and death. We can only save their lives if we act with a sense of urgency and if we act collectively. A chance to save lives is lost with every day that is passing. Children in Yemen just want what every child wants: to survive and have a childhood, a future, a chance to achieve their dreams, a chance to grow up safe in an environment that they love. UNICEF has been in Yemen since the 1950s and continued to expand its presence in Yemen when the conflict escalated. Reaching the most vulnerable children has been our top priority, regardless of who controls the territory where they live. Despite the challenges, we continue to deliver life-saving assistance. Since 2017, we are providing every quarter emergency cash assistance to 1.5 million of the most vulnerable households, benefiting around 19 million people. We are providing clean water, including to nearly 1 million people, through over 270 solar-powered water systems we have put in place. And we are protecting children against vaccine-preventable diseases. We just concluded a polio vaccination, which reached over 5 million children under the age of 5. And we're keeping primary healthcare centers and hospitals operational in Yemen, where half of the health centers have stopped functioning due to conflict-related causes. And we're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as we stay and deliver against all odds, we are facing a funding cliff. Our humanitarian appeal for children for 2021 of $576 million is so far less than 20% funded. Without urgent funding, all of our programs will be affected, from nutrition, health, and WASH to our support for education and child protection. And we appreciate all donors for their generous contributions over the years. But now we need your help once again. The children of Yemen need your help more urgently than ever. And above all, they need peace. Peace to give them a chance to become the adults that Yemen and the world needs when this war comes to an end. Thank you very much, Mark.
I thank the Executive Director for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Luigi Di Maio, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy.
Excellencies, ministers, distinguished delegates, I wish to thank my Swedish and Swiss colleagues and UN Secretary General for organizing and hosting today's conference. What we face in the Republic of Yemen is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world because of its magnitude, severity, and complexity. Yemeni population have been suffering for too long. As the crisis entered its 7th year, more than 20 million people require assistance or protection. Almost half of all families are in deep need. Over years, Italy has been on their side and will continue to provide Yemeni people with humanitarian assistance. I'm honored to announce that we pledge a financial contribution worth €5 million to the Central Emergency Relief Fund for 2021. It is important to replenish this fund in order to support Yemen and ensure a rapid, flexible, and efficient response as coordinated by the UN. Yet this is not enough. As members of the international community, we must raise our efforts to address the Yemeni crisis in its root causes. The vicious circle of conflict, violence, and abuses against the civilian population needs to be stopped. All the most vulnerable and exposed social groups need to be protected. I refer in particular to children, women, the elderly, and disabled. The ongoing conflict in the country remains the leading cause of the deterioration in its humanitarian conditions. Combats have intensified on many battlefronts. On several occasions, attacks directly target civilians or civilian areas. They caused a heavy toll of victims among the population. The international engagement cannot be limited to financial support. We have to do more for the promotion and respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. Italy reiterates its call to all parties in the conflict to protect civilians and humanitarian operators. They must comply with international humanitarian law and remove all obstacles to humanitarian assistance. They must grant a full, safe, and complete humanitarian access. At the same time, we once again call on all Yemeni parties and all relevant stakeholders to engage in dialogue and to facilitate the ongoing UN mediation efforts. There is no alternative to a political negotiated process for pulling the country away from the conflict. This is the only way for a durable and sustainable peace in Yemen. Therefore, Italy will continue to support the UN mediation led by the UN Special Envoy, Mr. Griffiths. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement, and I'd like to hand over the moderation now to Mr. Manuel Bessler, Delegate of the Federal Council and Head of Swiss Humanitarian Aid. Manuel.
Thank you very much, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we are about halfway through with our list of speakers. Please stick to the 3 minutes. I would like to call on Austria. I would like to call His Excellency Mr. Peter Launsky, Tiefenthal, the Secretary General of the Federal Ministry of European and International Affairs of the Republic of Austria. Mr. Launsky, the floor is yours, please. Mr. Launsky, is Austria with us? If not, we go on, we come back to Austria. Luxembourg, His Excellency Jean Asselborn, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Excellency, are you with us?
Secretary General Guterres, dear Antonio, dear Anne, dear Ignacio, dear colleagues. I am honored to join you today in mobilizing international support for the people of Yemen. I wish to thank Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Nations for this very timely initiative. 6 years of war have brought immense suffering to the people of Yemen. In recent weeks, the fighting has escalated once again. The attack launched by the Houthi militia against Marib puts millions of lives at risk and must stop immediately. All parties must ensure compliance with international humanitarian law and protect civilians and key civilian infrastructure. A needs-based approach remains at the core of Luxembourg's humanitarian strategy. Humanitarian assistance should reach all people in need, regardless of their political, their religious, their ethnic affiliation, or their geographic location. Luxembourg has shown solidarity with the people of Yemen over the past years. Today, I am pleased to announce that in 2021, Luxembourg will allocate at least €1.85 million to the crisis in Yemen. Our humanitarian assistance will be channeled through the World Food Programme, the ICRC, the Yemen Humanitarian Fund managed by OCHA, as well as NGOs. In the coming years, Luxembourg will maintain a significant level of support in the framework of its multi-year founding agreements with World Food Programme and ICRC. Our objective is to provide timely and predictable funding to our humanitarian partners while granting them maximum flexibility in responding to the most urgent needs. We will also continue to support the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, which helps with life-saving assistance in Yemen. For humanitarian efforts to be successful, we cannot accept any limitation on access to life-saving aid. State and non-state actors have to guarantee the safety and access of humanitarian personnel. Only a negotiated political solution involving a meaningful participation of all parties concerned, including the civil society, women and youth, can end the conflict in Yemen. Allow me, therefore, to conclude by reiterating Luxembourg's full support for the UN-led process and the work of Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. Thank you.
Minister, thank you. Also the pledge, we call again on Austria. His Excellency, Mr. Peter Launsky, Tiefenthal, the Secretary General of the Federal Ministry of European and International Affairs of Austria. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, dear colleagues, Austria would like to thank Sweden, Switzerland and UN OCHA for their initiative to convene this event and shed light on the immense humanitarian needs of the people in Yemen. The humanitarian situation in Yemen is deeply worrying. Years of conflict, natural disasters, and the threat of COVID-19 forecast a dire outlook for the Yemeni people. 80% of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance. 6 out of 10 people are unable to provide for themselves and crucially depend on food assistance, a fact tragically reflected in the exceedingly high malnutrition rates among children under 5. Amid this disastrous humanitarian situation and the added burden of COVID-19, ailing medical and wash infrastructure are especially distressing. Medicine and medical supplies are scarce as it is. Almost half of all hospitals and healthcare facilities are out of service, resulting in almost 20 million people in need of basic and emergency health care. Coupled with already prevalent diseases like cholera, the resilience against another threat is slim. After almost 6 years of conflict and multifaceted challenges, it has become more difficult and complex than ever to provide the much-needed relief. All parties to the conflict must respect international humanitarian law in order to fulfill their important mission that we are all supporting here today. Free and unhindered access granted to humanitarian organizations, and the safety and security of humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Austria fully supports the efforts of the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths to restart the political process, which is the only way to a sustainable peace in Yemen and to an end to this humanitarian emergency. In this respect, we welcome the recent formation of a unity government, and we reiterated our firm condemnation of the attack of Aden Airport targeting the arriving government. The perpetrators must be held accountable. Austria has lived up to its humanitarian obligations in the past and will continue to support the international efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people of Yemen. Therefore, supporting the International Committee of the Red Cross and UNICEF in Yemen with an additional total of €6 million. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Thank you to Austria. I call now on Morocco. I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Nasser Bourita, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, African Cooperation and Moroccan Expatriates of the Kingdom. Please, Minister.
وشكر جلالته لمعالي الأمين العام على الدعوة الكريمة التي تفضلها بتوجيهها إلى المملكة المغربية للمشاركة في هذا المؤتمر الدولي من أجل مساعدة الشعب اليمني الشقيق. والشكر موصول إلى حكومتي سويسرا والسويد لتنظيمهما لهذا الحدث وقيادة هذا الجهد الدولي المهم. إن الأزمة الإنسانية غير المسبوقة في هذا البلد الشقيق والمصنفة كأكبر أزمة إنسانية في العالم بأرقامها المخيفة حول ملايين النازحين والمحتجزين للغذاء والدواء تسائل ضمير المجتمع الدولي برمته وتحثه على التعبئة وتوحيد الجهود لتمكين اليمنيين من العيش في كنف الأمن والسلام والاستقرار. لذا فإن الأمر يحتاج في تقديرنا إلى جهد تضامني دولي أوسع لا يقتصر على دول بعينها قدمت ولا زالت مساعدات سخية مكنت حتى الآن من تجنب الأسواق. إنما نسجله بكل أسف وحسرة أن هناك حاجة ملحة وعاجلة لتفادي شبح المجاعة الذي يتهدد 16 مليون يمني خلال السنة الحالية. وفي ظل نسق تصعيدي للحرب سيحتاج ربما 22 مليون شخص إلى مساعدة إنسانية، أي ما يعادل 75% من سكان اليمن. لذا فإن المملكة المغربية بقيادة صاحب الجلالة الملك محمد السادس أكدت دوما على ضرورة إلى أهمية قصوى للجوانب الإنسانية بالنظر إلى دورها الحيوي بالنسبة للمدنيين اليمنيين. ومن هذا المنطلق يطيب لي أن أعلن أن صاحب الجلالة الملك محمد السادس أمر بتقديم مبلغ $1 مليون لفائدة الشعب اليمني مساهمة من المملكة المغربية في هذا الجهد التضامني الدولي. فإذا كانت المساعدات الإغاثية قد مكنت وكالات الأمم المتحدة العاملة في اليمن مرحليا من التخفيف من وطأة شبح المجاعة والأمراض اللذين يتربصان بالشعب اليمني، فإن استمرار غياب الأفق السياسي للأزمة فضلا عن فرض سياسة الأمر الواقع سيفاقم لا محالة من الوضع الإنساني في هذا البلد. لذلك فإن المملكة المغربية تؤكد أنه لا يمكن حل الأزمة الإنسانية في هذا البلد إلا عبر إيجاد حل سياسي شامل ومستدام يحفظ لليمن الشقيق وحدته وسيادته وفق المرجعيات المعروفة لا سيما القرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2216. وفي هذا السياق أجدد دعم المملكة المغربية لجهود المبعوث الأممي لليمن سعادة السيد مارتن غريفيث ومساعديه ودعم مساعيه الحثيثة للتوصل لاتفاق حول الإعلان المشترك الذي يتضمن وقفا شاملا لإطلاق النار والشروع في استئناف المشاورات السياسية في أقرب وقت، إضافة إلى ترتيبات إنسانية لتخفيف معاناة الشعب اليمني جراء الصراع. كما لا يفوتني الإشادة بدور وكالات الأمم المتحدة في إيصال المساعدات الإنسانية إلى الشعب اليمني الشقيق، مطالبا بتمكينها من أداء عملها دون عوائق. وأنتهز هذه الفرصة في الأخير للإعراب عن ترحيب ودعم المملكة المغربية للحكومة اليمنية الجديدة معربا عن الأمل في أن تتمكن هذه الحكومة من القيام بمهامها في أحسن الظروف بما يخدم تطلعات الشعب اليمني الشقيق إلى السلم والاستقرار ورفع المعاناة عنه. شكرا لكم.
Shukran Niktir, Minister. We move on to Iceland. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Kudular Tordarso. He is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Development Cooperation of the Republic of Iceland. Minister, the floor is yours, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here today, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains the worst in the world. The country is on the brink of a famine which will be the most dire we have seen in decades, if not stopped. The need for effective, efficient, and strategic funding for humanitarian operation in Yemen has therefore never been as urgent. Iceland is committed to play its part, and today I am announcing a three-year pledge of a total value of 285 million Icelandic kroner, or 95 million per year. The funds will be directed through three of Iceland's priority humanitarian partners: WFP, UNFPA, and OCHA, all of which are playing a critical role in Yemen. This year, the breakdown will be as follows. 25 million Icelandic kroner will go to OCHA's Yemen Humanitarian Fund, enabling OCHA to mobilize and channel resources to humanitarian partners based on critical needs of millions of Yemenis affected by the crisis. 30 million Icelandic kroner will go to WFP, which is providing food assistance to the most vulnerable. But malnutrition rates among women and children in Yemen are among the highest in the world. And 40 million Icelandic krona will go to UNFPA, which plays a leading role in protecting Yemeni women and girls from gender-based violence and maintaining their dignity and respect. It is a well-known fact that in times of crisis, women and girls are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence and exploitations as families and communities become dispersed and chaotic conditions contribute to a sense of lawlessness. It is therefore critical to provide funding for humanitarian actors such as UNFPA. Iceland is a devoted human rights advocate, and as such, I would also like to take this opportunity to emphasize the importance of respect for international humanitarian law and unhindered humanitarian access in Yemen. It is absolutely vital that all aid agencies operating in the country can deliver effective assistance and that civilians are protected. In closing, let me stress how the vicious cycle of violence in Yemen remains deeply concerning. The people of Yemen have suffered too much and too long. The conflict needs to be brought to an end through a durable political solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Iceland. Thank you to the Minister. Et maintenant la France. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nicolas de Rivière, the Permanent Representative of France to the UN. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like first of all to thank Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Nations for organizing the conference. I'm speaking on behalf of my minister, who could unfortunately not join us today. Thanks to you, this event allows the international community to remain mobilized for a country in distress, Yemen. The immensity of humanitarian needs is known to all. The particularly alarming degradation of food and security and the outbreak of a famine putting at risk millions of lives is intolerable, as well as the continuation of attacks against populations and civil infrastructures. We call on all parties to ensure a safe and unhindered humanitarian access to populations in need through the territory of Yemen, in particular in the areas controlled by the Houthis. For millions of Yemeni people, it is vital that humanitarian aid reaches them effectively and expeditiously. Furthermore, we call for a cessation of hostilities, in particular of the offensive led by the Houthis in Marib, where about 1 million displaced people are located, as well as the strikes on the Saudi territory. We call for an immediate ceasefire. The time of war has to come to an end. It has lasted for too long. We call for the resumption of negotiations. In this regard, France continues its constant commitment in close cooperation with the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen towards a global and inclusive political solution. In 2021, France will contribute to the humanitarian response in Yemen up to at least 11 million euros. We have also substantially increased our unearmarked contributions to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as well as to the World Food Programme. Finally, I would like to commend the continued effort of the United Nations and underline our willingness to work with David Gressly, the new United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Yemen. Our unity is more necessary than ever to put an end to the plight endured by the Yemeni people. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup, la France. Merci, Mr. Permanent Representative of France to the UN. We go now to Belgium. I call on Her Excellency, Ms. Miriam Kittier. She is the Minister of Development Cooperation and of Major Cities of the Kingdom of Belgium. Madame, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Excellency. Assalamu alaikum. I recently heard a strong Yemeni woman, a representative of a civil society organization, say that Yemen was not a forgotten crisis. No, according to her, it was an ignored one, that the world was turning its back to it. Dear Excellencies, I hope that at the end of today's conference, together we prove her wrong. After 6 years of crisis, an unacceptable number of people remain in need. The numbers are staggering. Therefore, we would assume that the world's attention remains focused on the humanitarian situation in Yemen. But those numbers do not seem to draw our attention anymore. We, the international community, have failed to protect the people of Yemen from indiscriminate violence and starvation. While conflict endures, these people pay the price. We are here today as donors to pledge our financial contribution as a response to the countless immediate needs. Belgium will contribute 5 million euro to the Yemen Humanitarian Fund. With our assistance, we especially aim to support local and national humanitarian workers. Very often, they are the only ones present in highly insecure areas. For this reason, I want to advocate for sufficient access of local Yemeni organizations to the Yemen Humanitarian Fund. Of course, financial support is essential and ever more urgent, but much more than money and goods, Yemenis need and deserve the silence of weapons and the protections of their rights. Salaries should be paid and people should be protected. Ladies and gentlemen, special attention is needed for the millions of children and women caught in the conflict. Often we see them as the victims who carry the heaviest burden, but we forgot that in many cases it is actually also them making the difference. Women build societies, young people construct hope. For peace to succeed and to be sustainable, they should get their seat at the table in peace negotiation. We are very concerned about the economic deterioration and the dire humanitarian situation. The lack of sufficient humanitarian access remains. And during our mandate in the UN Security Council, Belgium repeatedly called for respect for international humanitarian law. And I repeat, this involves the provision of humanitarian access and accountability of warring parties. We also consistently demanded a political solution to the conflict. Belgium will continue to support the international efforts to pursue peace in Yemen. We firmly back the efforts of the UN Special Envoy in this regard and call for respect of the existing UN resolution. Likewise, we support and insist on the implementation of the Stockholm and Riyadh agreements. Ladies and gentlemen, as a final note, I would like each of us to remember that there is a person behind those huge numbers of people in need of assistance. My discussion with the Yemeni woman reminded me just that. So let's not forget them, let's not fail them, and let's keep on listening to their voice. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We move on to Greece. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nikos Dendias, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hellenic Republic. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Since the onset of hostilities nearly 6 years ago, Greece has been closely following the tragic developments in war-torn Yemen. We have expressed our serious concerns over the plight of the Yemeni people. We have actively contributed to humanitarian efforts, both through national and European Union assistance. As active supporters of peace and security in our already fragile neighborhood, we have also emphasized the ramification of the conflict on regional stability and development. Unfortunately, the situation in Yemen remains critical as one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. It is driven by continuous and escalating conflict as well as economic collapse. Last year, the country was also faced with natural disasters, the cholera epidemic and the global COVID-19 pandemic. All the above have further exacerbated the already dire situation. Greece remains seriously concerned with the devastating realities on the ground. Of particular concern to us all is the fact that by mid-2020, Yemen returned to alarming levels of food insecurity. Widespread famine and surging malnutrition rates among children under the age of 5 are at their highest level yet. According to the United Nations Office of Humanitarian Affairs, during the past 2 years, the worst famine in a generation was averted. However, if looming challenges are not adequately addressed with the urgency they require, we are nearing an irreversible situation. There will be further tragic consequences for the people of Yemen. The European Union has allocated 896 million euros as humanitarian assistance and development aid since the beginning of the conflict. European Union humanitarian partners continue to help populations in active war fronts in the north-south of the country, but often face constraints and security challenges. My country is fully aware that in order to avert the worst-case scenario, there is a pressing need to increase international aid funds, guarantee unrestricted access of humanitarian agencies to people that urgently require assistance, and address the political and economic drivers of the crisis. In light of our grave concerns with regard to the situation, Greece is ready to pledge, again this year, a symbolic contribution in the form of emergency assistance to the people of Yemen. We believe that in order to achieve this, substantial progress must be made towards a negotiated and viable political solution. In this vein, missile or any attacks that directly violate international law and compromise stability in the region need to be strongly condemned. The time to end the conflict is now, for the sake of the country, for the sake of its people, for the sake of the region as a whole. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to Greece. We move on to Slovenia. I give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Stanislav Raskan, the Minister of Development, Development Cooperation of the Republic of Slovenia. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by thanking the United Nations and the governments of Sweden and Switzerland for convening today's high-level pledging event for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. We are deeply troubled by the devastating humanitarian situation in Yemen and alarmed by the increasing food insecurity and reports revealing the highest level of acute malnutrition ever. As millions of people in Yemen struggle for survival, humanitarian assistance and unhindered access to humanitarian aid for all the people in need is for the utmost importance. Since the beginning of the crisis, Slovenia has contributed 400,000 euros for addressing the pressing needs for the people in Yemen. This year, we are committed to increase our aid pledge for Yemen by 20% compared to previous years. In this regard, I am pleased to announce Slovenia's contribution to 120,000 euros to International Committee for the Red Cross in the form of multi-year donation for the period 2021-2023. However, humanitarian aid alone cannot resolve the situation. Only an inclusive Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process can bring an end to the conflict and heal the divides. Slovenia is deeply concerned by the news of renewed military escalation in Yemen. The Houthis should immediately cease the offensive in Marib. We urge all the parties to break the circles of violence and engage constructively to the UN Special Envoy's efforts to achieve peace in Yemen. We encourage the use of confidence-building measures. In this regard, the resumption of talks on a possible prisoner exchange between Yemen's warring parties is a welcome step. Slovenia is also seriously concerned by the conclusions of Yemen panel of experts that all parties continue to commit violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law with impunity. These violations must stop immediately, and those responsible must be held accountable. In conclusion, Slovenia would like to encourage all actors of the international community to use their influence on parties to the conflict, as well as UN Security Council members to redouble their efforts and support for all political settlement. In this context, Slovenia commends the increased diplomatic engagement and the priority placed by the United States and on ending the conflict in Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you to Slovenia. Dear colleagues, Excellencies, we move on to Russia. I call on His Excellency, Mr. Dmitry Polansky, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the UN. Mr. Polansky, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we thank the organizers for this timely event. Humanitarian catastrophe, which long-suffering population of Yemen is facing, reached unprecedented scale. The mere existence of such a crisis in the 21st century is a reason for grave concern. The 6th year of acute military political crisis in this Arab country must be resolved as soon as possible. We are compelled to state with regret that the logic of armed confrontation still prevails. Of particular concern is the situation in Marib, where bloody clashes resumed earlier this February, as a result of which more than 8,000 people were forced to leave their homes. At the same time, we welcome the new government of the Republic of Yemen, with representatives of the southern regions of the country having significant part of the ministerial portfolios for the first time. It is an important step towards the practical implementation of the Riyadh Agreement of November 5, 2019 on the normalization of situation in the south of Yemen. We are convinced that this step can lead to enhanced public safety and will allow us to focus on solving acute socio-economic and humanitarian problems in this part of the country. Distinguished colleagues, Yemen's huge humanitarian challenges require urgent solutions. Large-scale assistance from the international community is needed to combat the widespread of famine and diseases, including coronavirus. In this regard, increasing necessary financial assistance to the UN programs to provide basic assistance, including ensuring food security of the population, access to clean water and medical services, would be a natural and timely response from the international community, including countries of the region. We consider the provision of assistance on a non-discriminatory basis to the entire population of the country to be a key factor in addressing the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. We call for the abandonment of those unilateral steps, both inside and outside Yemen, which complicate the work of humanitarian workers. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Polanski. We move on to Finland. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Phil Skinnari, the Minister for Development, Cooperation and Foreign Trade of the Republic of Finland. Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank our hosts, United Nations and the governments of Switzerland and Sweden, for bringing us together virtually today. Years of conflict in Yemen have devastated the lives of millions of people, and Yemen has become the single largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Continued fighting, high food prices, failing economy, and the COVID-19 outbreak have pushed millions of Yemenis, many of them children, to the brink of famine. In the past years, we have highlighted the admirable efforts that relief workers and humanitarian organizations have done in order to reach Yemenis in need. I would like to use this opportunity to express my appreciation to all governments and entities which have supported and continue to support their tireless work. The recent report by the UN panel of experts of Yemen paints a very grim picture regarding violations of international humanitarian law. The report also notes money laundering and corruption. These messages obviously do not encourage donor countries to increase funding. However, at the same time, the humanitarian response in Yemen is severely underfunded, and the people of Yemen are in desperate need of support. Preventing famine must be the most urgent priority now. Finland will continue to support humanitarian assistance to Yemen in 2021. We are currently preparing our funding through different channels. Allow me also to refer to our contribution to the UN Central Emergency Response Fund and to our core funding as a way of helping our humanitarian partners to respond in a timely and flexible manner. I will end my intervention by stressing the vital need for all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and principles. It is essential to ensure that the protection of those in need of assistance, as well as those who are providing help. As an incoming co-chair of the Good Humanitarian Donorship Group, Finland will step up efforts to prevent and mitigate any adverse effects of counterterrorism and restrictive measures on humanitarian action. Finland calls on all parties to support the UN-led peace efforts. The devastating conflict in Yemen must finally be brought to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you to Finland. Dear colleagues, Excellencies, I pass now on to Carl Skauk from Sweden. He is the Deputy Director General, Head of the Department of UN Policy, Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs in the Swedish Foreign Ministry for the further proceedings. Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Manuel. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to again remind Excellencies to limit your interventions to 3 minutes maximum. I shall now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Dai Bing, Deputy Permanent Representative of China to the UN. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. China appreciates the timely convening of this event by UN and the government of Sweden and Switzerland. Yemen is now facing multiple challenges like violent conflict, economic crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the food insecurity. It is really a large-scale humanitarian disaster. The international community must act immediately, increasing assistance to Yemen, prevent further deterioration of the crisis. The entities of the UN system should effectively carry out humanitarian operations and strengthen coordination with regional countries and organizations. All parties to the conflict must ensure the humanitarian access so as to make the humanitarian supplies delivered to the people in need, the vulnerable groups such as women and children effectively protected. The political settlement represents the only solution to the Yemen issue. Yemen's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity must be fully respected. We call upon all parties to the conflict to achieve a ceasefire as soon as possible. The international community should continue to support the role of the UN as the main channel of the mediation. It is imperative for all relevant parties to put the interests of Yemen and its people first, effectively implement the Stockholm Agreement and the Riyadh Agreement, push forward the political settlement process, try to find a solution acceptable to all parties based on consensus reached at the international and regional levels and within Yemen. China has been for a long time providing large amounts of humanitarian assistance to Yemen through bilateral and multilateral channels. Between 2017 and 2020, China provided more than 11,000 tons of food aid to Yemen. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19, China has donated testing kits, PPEs, and medical masks to help Yemen fight the pandemic. We will continue to provide food, medical supplies, and other humanitarian assistance. China will join the international community to make all efforts to continue to the alleviation of humanitarian sufferings and the restoration of stability and a normal order in Yemen at an early date. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Deputy Permanent Representative of China to the UN for his statement. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, who is joining us live from Sana'a in Yemen. Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carl. I did indeed come back to Sana'a today from field trips to Amran and Hacha to the north. And I'll be blunt, because I am heartbroken and outraged by what I have witnessed. Children are dying now. It's not a theoretical think of a famine of the future if this and that doesn't happen. They are dying now because we haven't been able to feed them adequately for a year. And because of the parties preventing work to happen as they should, because the war is ongoing. In Amran, I met 100 families from the Muhammadin minority. They fled war in Thais. Now they feed themselves from the garbage dump of Sana'a. They told me there isn't much food left in the garbage dump anymore because everybody's so poor now. These people are living in subhuman conditions, cannot be allowed to happen in 2021. Then in Hajjah, in the clinic for the severely malnourished children, I met Kadja, beautiful girl. I thought she was 3 or 4 years old. She was 9, so stunted because of chronic malnutrition over a very long time. Her mother told me, please tell the world the following. I had 14 children, 14. 5 are dead. Kadja cannot walk anymore. That's why I begged to come to this clinic. It is heartbreaking to see what's happening. So what do we need? 3 things. We need more money that is being pledged here today. It is not enough what is being pledged to avert the famine of this generation. Number 2, we need a famine prevention ceasefire. We need it to be clear by these men with guns and power that they are playing with millions of lives of children, women, and the innocent in their senseless war. And thirdly, we need massive diplomatic effort on the parties on the ground to allow free and unimpeded access to all of the corners of Yemen. Because today we're held back by too many bureaucrats, too many authorities, too many armed men, and too many roadblocks to really reach all. All from me here.
I thank the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council for his testimony and statement. I shall now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Evaristo Bortolo, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of the Republic of Malta. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, on behalf of the Government of Malta, I would like to thank the organizers for holding this conference, encouraging us to come together once again to curtail further deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. Malta fully supports the timely convening of the 2021 high-level pledging event for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Almost 7 years have elapsed since the outbreak of this protracted conflict, which has resulted in the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. This conference provides an opportunity for the international community, as well as the regional actors, to work together in a constructive and cooperative manner for the benefit of the people of Yemen. Malta is fully supportive of the role and presence of the UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations in all parts of the country that ensure that the vital humanitarian assistance reaches the intended destination. My country also wishes to pay tribute to all the humanitarian actors in their relentless effort to deliver life-saving support to all those in need in very challenging circumstances. In this context, Malta joins other countries in encouraging all parties to the conflict to allow unhindered immediate delivery of life-saving assistance to intended beneficiaries while respecting the international humanitarian law. Even though this humanitarian crisis can mainly be solved through a political solution, a scale-up of the humanitarian effort to respond to immediate needs on the ground is unarguably critical at this juncture. We fully support that vaccine ceasefires be declared in conflict zones to enable healthcare workers to inoculate local populations against the ongoing pandemic. Global access to COVID-19 vaccines should be an urgent international priority, making sure that no one is left behind, especially in regions facing instability and armed conflict, including Yemen. Malta also welcomes the recent positive announcements and decisions towards a de-escalation of hostilities within the Yemeni war. In this vein, it is time for the international community to build on this momentum and call upon all parties to lay down all weapons, agree to a nationwide ceasefire, and return to the negotiating table. Malta considers the Stockholm Agreement as a milestone in the process of peace building and augurs that all sides, notwithstanding the numerous challenges, will persevere in the realization of this agreement. In this regard, Malta reiterates its full support to all UN-led peace efforts, particularly those of UNSA Martin Griffiths. Malta hopes that a negotiated settlement that respects the independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Yemen is achieved without further delay. To conclude, I am pleased to announce that the government of Malta is again dedicating part of its yearly humanitarian budget in aid of the people of Yemen to assist in mitigating their challenges. The hardship faced by the people of Yemen, especially the children, as the most vulnerable group of the population, continues to touch a chord with the people of Malta. Assisted by the Maltese government, a women-led NGO is dispatching goods, including essential items for babies and children of Yemen, that have been generously donated by the people of Malta. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of the Republic of Malta for his statement. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving the International Committee of the Red Cross the opportunity to speak today. The challenges in Yemen are multi-layered, interlinked, and massive. One of those challenges